Dim light was pouring in from the windows of the building. Hasty footsteps were heard in the corridor. A man was running towards the saving door. However, as soon as the people approached, the man kicked the door down, after which frightened screams were heard that the hunter Soken had arrived. One of his subordinates put her hand on the glass room, saying that there were children here. Soken immediately smashed the glass to pieces. The boy looked at the man with huge serious eyes when he asked the children if they were okay. Soken smiled kindly at the kids and said that they could go out, while the other hunters said whatever they wanted, since they needed to assess the children's condition. Soken picked the boy up in his arms, asking if they were hurt. However, the kid did not answer because he was watching the hunters lay the criminals on the floor. He heard someone discontentedly offer to look at the self-confident chief. He was lying on the floor and begging for his life. Soken looked at the boy in his arms and asked him his name, surprising the boy. He looked at the man warily and asked himself what he had to do to make this man angry. The boy said his name was number 12 and then hugged Soken tightly around the neck. Soken pulled the boy out in his arms and looked at his cute face, surprised by his name. He carefully placed the boy on the floor. Soken suddenly turned to the criminal and began to kick him, shouting curses. As he kicked the man again, the child thought about power. This scene was forever imprinted in his eyes, and he thought about how this was an overwhelming power that no one could look down on, and at that moment, someone called out to Soken. A woman burst into the room and Soken turned around and asked what brought the inspector here, to which she immediately began to shout that it was the man who brought her here because she knew he would start something like this again, after which she demanded that he let the criminal go. After this angry tirade, the woman exhaled and calmly said that she appreciated Soken's help, but he was making their lives difficult by behaving like this. The boy approached the adults and asked the woman if she was Soken's boss. She leaned over and smiled at the child, explaining that she was just the one who scolded him when he did something bad, to which the boy asked if that wasn't the point of a boss, because the lab boss always scolded the other members of the lab because he hated everyone. The inspector turned to the criminal and an ominous aura immediately wafted from her as she said that she would definitely scold this bad person. The boy looked at the woman carefully and noticed that she was weak, then asked if she was a hunter. She smiled awkwardly and said that she was not a hunter because she was not very strong, but asked him not to judge a book by its cover. The woman explained to the child that there are many ways to scold a person, such as beating, and someone, referring to Soken, knows about this, to which the boy immediately asked what he must do to become like her. The woman patted the child's head and said that he must study hard and pass the exam given by the state, and after passing the exam, he must also work hard to climb the corporate ladder. Then the boy thought about the irresistible power of a hunter and another force that controlled this hunter, because this was the moment that determined the path of his life. 19 years later, on May 31, 2044, at the Ability Management Agency in Cheonggu District, Seoul, South Korea. The man looked sternly at the people in front of him and said that Dungeon 2 in Yindungpo and Dungeon 1 in Inwangsan Mountain had reached the second level threat today. The hall fell silent and he thought that these bad people would never change. His face darkened as he asked if the hunters were going to listen because even if they were C-rank dungeons, the interior was unstable due to the increased threat level, and then demanded that the people wake up and listen so that they wouldn't get lost when they got there. The hunters immediately started coughing, and then the man continued to say that Team 2 would be in charge of the B2 rank Yindungpo dungeon, and then asked if they had any questions. The girl looked at the leader and said that there were no questions, after which she heard that Team 1 could take the Tian dungeon, and Teams 3 and 4 were currently resting because they had recently gone into a dungeon, so another guild would take the Inwangsan Mountain dungeon. The man stood up and began to scroll through something on the computer when he said that they had already prepared the equipment, so he asked them to check everything they had before entering at 14 o'clock. He began to put the documents in a folder, again asking if they had any questions. The hunters began to stretch because they were tired of sitting, after which the man asked them to have lunch and be ready by 2 o'clock. People began to leave the conference room. One of the women remained, and the man immediately asked what happened to Jean. She looked at the man with displeasure and asked why there was no talk about the dungeon she had talked about. He glanced at the map and asked if they were talking about the dungeon in Bangi-do, but it was only D rank, and he thought that Jion should know that they only send people out on raids after they reach threat level 2, to which the woman explained that she just didn't have a good feeling about it. The man exhaled heavily and said that if they closed the dungeon based on her feelings alone, they would be inundated with media, so she shouldn't abuse her powers just because she was an S-rank hunter. Jion slapped the table in displeasure and said that abusing his power was exactly what he was doing, then called him a kid, but the man asked her if she had ever seen a more capable and skilled child. Jion jumped up from her chair and said that she would have fired him long ago if he wasn't so good at his job, but the man replied that if a hunter attacked a government employee, it would be terrible for her. She hung her head and said that she really had a bad feeling. However, the man was almost out the door, so with a big smile he said that he was very sorry, but it was no longer his working hours, so he asked her not to contact him. She was taken aback by the guy saying that he couldn't contact him anyway if he was in the dungeon, and that was what he liked, to which the woman just shouted out HW's name. 2 days later, in Busan, a question was raised at a hotel about whether this watch was the one that was mentioned in the news. HW showed the watch on his hand with a smile and said that it was a masterpiece created by the government and the SK Man Research Lab, but it was still in the testing stage, so there were only 2 of them in the world, to which the girls were delighted and admired that the guy must be an excellent hunter. He explained that he had a license, but he was not a hunter because he worked for an ability management agency that helped hunters navigate dungeons more easily. He explained that he was a direct subordinate to the director of the agency and that one of the girls asked if he was referring to that person. She asked about the best hunter in their country, Soken, to which the man immediately replied that he was embarrassed to say, but he was his father. The second girl asked him in surprise if Soken was his father, after which HW explained that he was adopted. He twirled the glass in his hands, saying that he had an accident when he was a child and lost his parents. He remembered Sok Ken frying him eggs and telling him that the agency director had saved him and adopted him, so he worked hard to repay that debt and was now working for him. He smiled at the other girl and asked her not to think that he got the job for nothing because he had worked so hard for it, and of course Sok Ken was known for being fair and honest. HWIE thought to himself that this was a lie when he heard the girls excitedly exclaim that it was cool for a father and son to work together, and then thought again that he wasn't a 100% son because he was just using the fact that he had a hunting license to his advantage. One of the girls raised her glass and asked why HWIE had come to Busan. HWE smiled and said that he was on vacation to celebrate his promotion, and even though he wasn't going to come, he was kicked out because he never takes time off, to which the girls laughed because they thought it was bad to work all the time, so he was on vacation too. HWE looked towards the bar and asked if he was bothering the girls, to which they immediately said that he wasn't bothering them because he showed them something really cool and asked if they could see it again. HWE held out his hand with the watch, and after asking what it was called, he explained that it was an exclusive miniature multimedia communication device for hunters, which they simply called the MANHWA watch. One of the girls asked if it was just a watch, to which the man then explained that it recognized the mana patterns of hunters, so only the owner could use it, and then offered to show how it worked. A screen with text appeared, and the girls immediately began to try, saying that they had seen it in the news about the dungeons. Suddenly, something caught their attention and they drew HWE's attention to the fact that the threat level of this dungeon was suddenly increasing. Indeed, phrases about the threat level of the dungeon and Bangyadu having increased from 2 to 3 immediately appeared on the screen. The screen immediately turned red. The girls immediately began to look at their phones, reading the news. Someone called HWE's phone, and it immediately sounded that there was very bad news. HWE said that he had already seen it, then asked if it was because of the dungeon in Bangyadu, then said that he didn't think anything bad would happen since it was a D-rank dungeon. But there was a large concentration of people in that area, to which the voice on the phone replied that it wasn't a D-rank dungeon at all. HWE heard that half of the Songpa district was destroyed as soon as it appeared, and the agency director was currently on the way with hunters who were ready, to which HWE froze in fear at first, and then asked the other person to calm down since he would be on his way soon, then asked for a helicopter, to which the other person asked him to hurry. A little later, when the helicopter took off, HWE thought about how half of the entire district was gone, but everything should be fine by the time he got there since the agency director was there. He held the microphone close to himself, thinking in frustration that he had come all this way for a vacation. He looked at the MANHWA watch that for some reason turned off when the pilot called out to him, saying that there were some things underneath. When HWE looked out the window, he saw a huge number of monsters. In 2044, on June 2nd, all the dungeons in the country were destroyed, and the man did not understand how this happened. The channels were broadcasting that they were continuing to share the latest news that the dungeon destruction phenomenon was happening not only in South Korea, but all over the world, and the status of the hunters who went on raids with Hunter Soken was still unconfirmed. And at that moment, the helicopter was flying over the burning city when HWE said that they still couldn't return to Busan, and since there were no flying monsters on their way, they should just look around to see if there were any survivors. HWE got out of the helicopter, saying that they would find survivors and go to the Ability Management Agency. Suddenly, a monster attacked him, forcing the man to fight back. After his victory, HWE was walking down the street between the destroyed houses. He activated the watch. It just opened because the screen said that one of the director Soken's devices was connected, and the next window showed that it was impossible to track his vital signs. HWE froze and thought in disbelief that Soken could really be dead, but he was the strongest hunter in South Korea, so that couldn't happen. The guy walked aimlessly down the street, thinking that the future he wanted was simple, because he wanted to dump all the annoying things on others and live comfortably, and to achieve this, he fought so much and was close to it. The man did not pay attention to the fire around him, Because he was caught up in the thoughts that he needed someone to support him, that's why he wanted to find survivors. He had to find someone, and suddenly this train of thought was interrupted by someone's cough, forcing him to turn around. Among the rubble lay Jiyeon, and HWE immediately called her his aunt, to which she indignantly reminded him that she had asked him not to call her that, but the man believed that it did not matter now, because he needed to look at her condition. He immediately knelt down next to her and asked if she knew what happened, to which the woman replied that all she knew was that a centipede that had crawled out of the dungeon of Banggi-do had caused it. The man uncorked the bottle of medicine. Jiyeon looked at the guy with displeasure and asked what this expensive potion would do, since she had been poisoned by the centipede's venom. So the man should have known that the potion would not work, but HWE stubbornly said that he did not know this, so he would just pour it until it worked. Jiyeon cursed, reminding him that she had said that the dungeon needed a raid, and then she was indignant at how the man dared to ignore his hunter's instincts. But HWE retorted that there was nothing less reliable than a hunter's instincts. Jiyeon called the man and said that she was done for anyway. She handed him the token and asked him to take it, hinting at who exactly it belonged to. HWE turned the token over to the side with Soken's name written on it, when he heard the woman say that he already knew what was wrong with it. She explained that she took the token just in case, so she was glad that she did, to which HWE was indignant, as he did not understand what was so happy about it, and Jiyeon said that the man was Soken's son anyway, so he should have the token. HWE looked around the destroyed buildings, reminding him that he was her real son, but Jiyeon believed that the man was Sakyeong's only son, so he should give him a proper funeral, to which HWE said that he would not give Jiyeon a funeral, so he forbade her to die. Jiyeon cursed again, but HWE looked at the woman with despair and asked her not to die. She squeezed her wound and said that she could not control it, and besides, she was lucky to have lived so long. The woman looked into the distance and called HWE. She remembered how, as a boy, he followed her around and called her his older sister, to which the man asked in surprise why she remembered this now. And Jiyeon said that he used to be nice, but now that he has grown a little older, he has become damn rude. She tried to draw HWE's attention back, but he cut her off, demanding that she shut up because he still had the potions, but Jiyeon stubbornly asked her to look back, to which he no less stubbornly asked her to shut up. The woman only said that her sword was in the to which HWE repeated like a prayer that he would call her little sister again if only she would shut up. But Jiyeon continued to say that she knew that a man learns to use a spear from a master, but still asked him to take her sword since it was a good weapon. She tried to smile and asked the man to survive. HWE was still sitting next to the dead Jiyeon, unable to move. He reached out to her face and closed his eyes. He stood up with difficulty, asking himself how he could survive in a world that was already destroyed. He picked up the sword, saying that he hated it. Near the Ability Management Agency, there was a centipede corpse, which was expected by the man. He walked past the claws, thinking about how being a hunter was a job that didn't even leave your corpse behind, and he was surprised to see the huge number of hunter corpses that it took to kill one centipede. He stopped, thinking about how the strongest hunter had actually died, leaving nothing behind except a token. So the man didn't understand what to do and whether he should continue looking for survivors, and most importantly, what to do if he found them. Mana flowed down the sword as HWE wondered if there were any survivors at all. He raised his sword and cursed. Mana crashed into the centipede corpse. Suddenly, the monster disappeared. HWE was left confused because he didn't understand where the centipede corpse had gone. A golden beam cut through the space and an unfamiliar object fell onto the asphalt. HWE realized that it had fallen out of the centipede, so he picked it up, muttering that he had never heard of monsters dropping objects before. He looked at the object, which resembled a watch, as it began verifying. HWE didn't understand what kind of object it was that first performed the authorization procedure, then postponed it, and then initiated an emergency procedure. A zero counter appeared, and the object asked if the man wanted to set a date. HWE didn't understand what it was muttering about, but the watch repeated the date setting over and over. The watch began beeping to return, then to initiate automatic activity, then asked if HWE wanted to do it. The man looked at the object closely, saying that it had asked him to set a date a while ago, but now it was doing something. The man brought the object closer, asking what it wanted from him. The clock suddenly turned the space red and began warning of danger detection, and the man wondered if it could be a centipede, but it was not, since the centipede from before did not have nearly such overwhelming energy. Suddenly, huge claws clawed at the building, and HWE thought about how this was the thing that turned South Korea into ruins, when the clock screamed that the probability of survival was 0%. HWE looked at the monster in fear and said that he did not care what it was, because if he could survive, he would do it now, to which the clock said personally confirmed. Steam came from the monster when the object announced that the emergency protocol was initiated and the verification protocol was started. Then it found an error, checked the qualification, which was unsuitable, so it decided to initiate the forced execution device. HWE looked into the golden eyes of the monster and thought about whether he should try to escape and if it was possible, And at that moment the thing initiated the final sequence, and then confirmed it, and checked the qualification, and then said that the world was to be destroyed, and at that moment the boy realized that it was impossible to escape from this thing. He got angry and shouted for the thing to shut up and just get him out of here alive. And at that moment the clock realized that HWE was the last survivor, and then confirmed the man's transfer to a random time, and then the darkness swallowed HWE. Suddenly, someone hit him in the face, telling him to wake up, so the man immediately grabbed the stranger's hand before he got hit in the face again. Many worried students stood over him, and one of the girls apologized, and then explained that he did not answer no matter how many times they called him, so they healed him, but asked him not to rush. HWE looked at the guys in confusion and raised himself up on his elbows when the same girl said that everything was really bad now, so she was wondering if the guy was a hunter, since he had a sword. HWE didn't listen to the girl, because he didn't understand where he was, since he remembered that his world was destroyed. In addition, he was wondering where they got the old uniform of the Hunter Academy when the students again started asking if everything was okay with him, and if he had a concussion, then she would be able to heal him with her own powers, and at that moment HWE read her name on the badge. He saw an old computer and a calendar, which said that it was now 2024. He looked at it in surprise, ignoring the worried questions of the children. Suddenly, one of the students became indignant because of Hyunwook, who demanded that they leave him alone. HWE turned around in surprise and looked at the guy. He turned to the man, saying that they didn't have time to wait for the man to fully regain consciousness. Hyunwook folded his arms, asking if the man had heard everything. However, HWE didn't listen to him and rushed to the window. He tensely assessed the situation. He didn't understand why he had ended up on April 5, 2024 in Myeongdong, Seoul, where a herd of black water buffalo had gathered, when out of 46 people in that building, only 5 survived. HWE stared into the distance and wondered what was going on. He remembered the events before he lost consciousness, the corpses of monsters and people filling the highway, Jeong and the agency director's badge, the suspicious object that appeared after the centipede disappeared, and then realized that he had returned to the past. HWE ran his hands through his hair and thought in confusion that he had published a paper on underground breakthroughs when he was in university, so I know this well. He remembered the portal and thought about how right before the development of the magic measurement device, when the dungeons were controlled manually, and also the dungeon was located in the center of Seoul, it was well controlled, although the dungeon was unpredictable, so what seemed calm yesterday could collapse today. He remembered the destroyed city and thought about how the management guild, who did not want to miss out on the amazing S-rank dungeon, mistakenly reported it as a B rank, so they received the news of the breakthrough only after the first wave of casualties and were late in taking action. He remembered the footage of the destroyed classrooms and thought about how the nearby high school students who were training to become hunters were trying to protect the civilians, but the students who had just awakened were at a loss as to how to deal with the dungeon breakthrough. At that time, only 2 students and 3 civilians were left alive, and this incident was a setback for the newly established Hunter Development School, but at the same time, it served as an impetus for the creation of numerous hunter-related laws. HWE leaned on the windowsill and thought that since he had the Jeon sword, he was confident that he could get out of this situation. He turned to the students and asked about how much time had passed since the dungeon breakthrough. HWE asked about whether the boys were high school hunters and whether they hadn't learned anything about dungeon breakthroughs, to which Hyun said that they came here today to learn about them. HWE walked up to the boys and demanded that they start learning right now, then asked again when the dungeon breakthrough happened, to which one of the girls answered that it was about 4 years ago. But this answer didn't satisfy the man either, since he didn't need to know the approximate time, because he believed that when talking about dungeons, exact numbers should be used. Hyun said that it had been 3 hours and 50 minutes and the man immediately complimented her, asking if they had contacted anyone outside, to which she replied that they had lost contact 2 hours ago and the last news they heard was that the hunters were going to attack the boss. HWE sighed and thought about how the agency director was on that team. He blamed himself for only attacking the boss without noticing that his students were dying, but that wouldn't happen this time. Hyunwook said that he didn't want to be rude, but he was curious about who HWE was. He frowned, not understanding how they could trust a person they didn't even know, and then asked if HWE had a hunter's license and if so, asked to see it. HWE had confused the guy with how he had lost it, so he thought to himself that he had it in his wallet, but how could he get a license that had written 2031 on it? He looked at the student carefully and thought that now that he thought about it, he didn't have any work ID, and even if he got out of this situation, he wouldn't be able to check the dungeon. And Hyunwook was still under the impression that HWE had lost his ID. HWE looked at the guy closely and asked about how all he had to do was prove that he was a hunter. The man grabbed his sword and summoned mana, and then swung the sword sharply, leaving a magical streak in the air. Hyunwook said that he would believe that the man was a hunter, and at that moment, the students began to talk about whether that meant they could escape, but they thought it was better than being alone. They looked at one of the students, whispering about how he wasn't the son of the D-Young group because they might come to save him. Hui remembered that Xian Young was the youngest child of one of the world's largest conglomerates, but his thoughts were interrupted by Haiyun asking if the man had a plan to survive. Hui stared at the girl silently, remembering that they treasured the Anin so much that after his death, they helped run the hunter school, founded the agency to manage abilities, and promoted his father to the director of the agency. And then the man thought about what would have happened if the guy had survived. He thought about how if he had no personality, and even if he was a little suspicious, he could become a hero that no one could criticize, and then he smirked and said that his plan was for them to go to the city hall. And in his mind, he thought about how he would at least weaken Xian Young's runes and create a scenario where he would save him from danger. Suddenly, men rushed into the room and one of them shouted that Hui was crazy because the city hall was too far from here. Hui asked him to look here, thinking that it was amazing for him to experience something he had only seen on tape, even in the survivors' testimonies. They said that this old man didn't listen to them just because they were young students. He rudely asked the old man if he wanted to die, and the old man asked if the hunter was threatening him, but Hui only asked him to shut up. He turned to the students and said that the truth was that even he himself would have a hard time saving himself, but he couldn't leave the children here, so he would help. The students looked at each other when Hui asked them if they wanted to leave because no one would stop them, but Haiyun thought that they couldn't leave the people. Then Hui came to the table and started talking about how the old man needed to hear that he was trying to save even people like him, but if he didn't want to, he wouldn't be stopped. The people heard that he needed someone who knew the Myeongdong area well, and one of the girls said that she could draw a map pretty well. She came to the table and laid out some paper. The girl took a pen and showed the place where they were, then she marked where the dungeon was, and since the raid on the boss had started 2 hours ago, the Minotaur should have been driven up the mountain by now. The students started whispering about how the Minotaur was an S-class monster and was too close, while Hui was busy talking about how the buffaloes probably followed the boss to Namsan Mountain, so only the monsters that separated from the herd should remain on the road. He drew something on the map and asked who knew what it was. Haiyun raised her hand and said that this was the outer part of the blockade that the hunters said they would set up a defense line to prevent the monsters from spreading to other places, to which the man confirmed this, saying that since City Hall Station was the headquarters, they just needed to get close to it and they would definitely survive. One of the men asked if they should just sit still in that case, because if the boss was defeated, the dungeon breakthrough would end, but Hui cut him off, saying that the Minotaur was a dictator. He looked out the window where a huge flock of monsters were wandering around, then explained that if the Minotaur told them to gather, they would gather. If he told the monsters to hunt, they would hunt, the same goes for food. But if their boss disappeared, what would they do then, having a good sense of smell? He looked at the people who didn't trust him and asked if there were any other disagreements with the plan. Hui smiled and asked if there was anyone among the mages who could draw runes. He touched the boy's forehead with his finger when he heard that the mages had messed up. Hui watched the students draw runes on each other and said that monsters were sensitive to mana and would target them, so they should remember to draw them properly. One of the girls asked if runes really hid mana because she had never heard of such a thing. Hui leaned towards the girl to make it easier for her to draw the rune and thought that if you compare them to the runes of this time, it was a reasonable reaction. But he said out loud that when a rune is on the forehead, it hides the mana related to a person, but it does not hide the magic that was cast. The man straightened up and asked the students if they knew how to activate the runes. He touched the Sonin rune and explained that you need to fill your hand with mana and touch the rune, then said to activate them right after he leaves, after which she thought that Sonin he will make the mana a little weaker. Hui went to the window and finally explained to the students that now he will release his mana and lure monsters in a circle, and when he passes by again, the children should start running, and the man himself will send the monsters away, and then catch up with those around him. He jumped out the window, shouting that it was time for him to go. The buffaloes immediately turned to Hui, but could not follow his actions. Hui abruptly stood up, muttering that he should put on a red cloak or something like that to attract attention. The students and adults started to leave the building, talking about Hui and who he was, when a girl asked Hyunwook what he was worried about now. One of the students immediately approached his classmates and said that Hui knew about the dungeon boss, so maybe he was one of the hunters who came here to raid, to which the girl replied that it might be strange, but he knew a lot of specific information. Haiyun thoughtfully said that he might have gotten hurt while leading the boss up the mountain, to which Xianyang immediately retorted that he couldn't be weak if he just fainted, to which he was immediately reminded that it was a minotaur. Hyunwook thoughtfully scratched the back of his head, saying that the only thing they could do now was trust the man, because he managed to drive away all the monsters in front of the building, and one of his classmates agreed with him. At that moment, an old man came up to them and said that they were done, to which Hyunwook immediately asked if they were done preparing. The old man promised that he would run as hard as he could, so he wanted to do that, and then asked the guys to be careful, to which Hyunwook said that they would have to work hard to survive. One of the girls saw Hui running and said that he was coming. Dust rose into the air. One of the monsters was running after him. Hui was fighting with all his might against the bulls. The space around him was filled with mana. Hyunwook waved his hand, calling for the people to follow him. Orders were immediately given for the hunter fighters to go forward, the mages to create a shield on both sides, and if there were any stragglers, they should just be blocked with shields, and Hyunwook should take care of them, after which the civilians will follow, so they should just run for their lives. The people continued to listen to how the healer and swordsman should stay behind, picking up those who fell and taking care of them, and at that moment Sonnen turned around. An enraged buffalo breathed in his face. Someone called out to Sonnen in fear, and suddenly there was a blow. At that moment, Hui knocked him down. Still fighting, he shouted at the students that they should run. One of the boys called out to him, looking at him with frightened words. However, Hui's eyes flashed, demanding that he move. The buffaloes piled on him when he again demanded that Sonnen run. The minotaurs walked freely through the city, and Hui, looking at them from the roof, cursed because he did not understand where they came from. He wiped the sweat off his face and muttered that it took him a lot of effort to get out of there, and he knew that he was the one who gathered them, but still. Hui remembered how it happened because he had purposely drained his mana to gather the monsters. Then he had slightly erased the rune that concealed the mana for Sonnen to put him in danger. Before the monsters he had lured with his mana would attack him, Hui had decided to stage a sacrifice scene after which a new hero would be born. The man looked ahead tiredly and thought that in the end no one had been hurt and everything had gone well, so everything was fine, but he didn't know what to do next. He remembered a scene from a famous movie and thought that if he had really traveled through time, that meant that 10-year-old Hui was also somewhere here, and he hoped that it wouldn't be like that movie where by changing the past, you can erase yourself from history. He looked at the crowd of buffaloes and remembered that the suspicious item also said that this world was guaranteed to be doomed to an apocalypse, and it must also be related to the Bangi-Do dungeon. The man perked up and repeated the Bangi-Do dungeon out loud. He glanced at his mana watch, deciding to check it, and then sighed in relief because it was still working while he was supplying it with mana. Hui called up the keyboard and began to type something. He looked at the screen and smiled in relief because the screen showed that he was in Seoul, the Sampa district, where everything happened on April 5, 2024. And at that moment he realized why he ended up on today, because it turns out there was already a reason for this, and then he asked as if the higher powers that be about sending him here to change the fate of the world. Hui flinched as someone cursed not far away. The hunters were running away from the water buffaloes, cursing about why these cows suddenly went crazy. He looked at the irritated water buffalo and guessed that maybe one of them was demanding more because it was like that a while ago, because that roothead was annoying the hell out of him. Hui watched the scene unfold and thought that it must be the hunters from Namsan, so he thought that there was no need to interfere because the boss was already defeated by this team. And at that moment, curses were heard again, and besides, there is the director of the agency. At that moment, Soken attacked with a smile on his face, saying that the monsters attack their subordinates without acknowledging them and that it is better for them. Thanks to this, the smaller monsters ran away, so he ordered to focus on tying up the boss first. Hui watched as the buffalo was thrown into the air by Soken's blow and realized that the legendary Korean hunters of modern history had gathered here, and he seemed to be occupying a VIP seat. Suddenly, a cry was heard that the hunters were starting, and ivy covered the Minotaur's paws. Hui was surprised to find that this was the unique magic of Archmage Yeoman. The woman was concentrating on casting her spell as Hui thought about how the magic was completely lost after her death, and he was honored to see it with his own eyes. Then he thought about how she died before the future, but what if he could save her? The danger level of the Bangi-Do dungeon had not changed for 20 years. 2S rank hunters would not be able to handle it if such a monster was hidden inside the stable dungeon. So the future could change if Hui could save those who were originally destined to die, such as the students of the model school, so he first needed to close the Bangi-Do dungeon where the one who destroyed Seoul was hiding. He rubbed his chin with a smile and muttered that it was not bad. Then he thought about how if he added to their debt by saving them, it would ensure his old age would be comfortable. At this moment, Soken continued to attack the Minotaur. Yeoman gripped her staff tighter and screamed, calling for mana. The Minotaur was immediately enveloped in ivy and roots. Its skin was scratched. This greatly angered the monster, and the Minotaur immediately grabbed a piece of asphalt. It squeezed the stone, intending to fight with it. The Minotaur swung its hammer, attacking the hunters. Hui looked at the battle one last time and thought that it was time for him to go to the city hall. Yeoman held back the monster's onslaught as best she could, asking Soken to cut off the Minotaur's remaining leg, and it immediately rushed into battle. The woman continued to stab, and her plants entangled the monster. However, it easily threw off the wooden bumps. The staff sank into the asphalt, releasing mana. The roots creaked and rushed towards the enemy. Suddenly, it was over and Hui said that the hunter had done a good job and then assumed that they were busy, so he asked them to ignore him and continue doing what they were doing. Eamon and Seokyeon froze in confusion, not understanding who was in front of them. Hui froze, trying to figure out who he was. The guy nervously rubbed his neck and said with a smile that he was just a passerby. Some time later, at the police station, an officer asked Seokyeon if he was sure he wanted to interrogate Hui alone. Even though they had confiscated his gun, the officer was still worried. He leaned towards Seokyeon and, without taking his eyes off Hui, admitted that the suspicious man had no social security number, awakened number, or fingerprints, to which Seokyeon tried to calm the officer down since he had something to ask. Hui calmly waited for the conversation when the officer asked Seokyeon to be careful. They were silent for a while, looking at each other. Finally, Soken broke the silence first, saying that he turned off the camera when they came here so they could just talk. He decided to introduce himself first when Hui thought about how seeing the young agency director felt like he was going back in time. He introduced himself while wondering if this agency director would save little Hui in a year and adopt him in 2 years. Soken held out a torn piece of paper and asked the man if he knew what it was. Hui was surprised to recognize the drawing that covered the wall of the lab. He stared at the director, who smirked, saying that he had expected this. Soken folded his arms across his chest, leaned back in his chair in a relaxed manner, and then asked the man not to be nervous and just talk. Hui heard that the hunters were very worried about him, which surprised the man because he immediately assumed that the director knew him. Soken nodded to himself and then said that if everything had gone according to plan, they would have met in a different situation. But either way, Hui had gotten out unharmed. And from what he heard, with the help of blue mana, fire, and a sword, to which the man replied that he didn't quite understand what he was talking about. Soken held out the piece of paper again and said that he was the teacher Kim had spoken of, and Hui realized that he had been mistaken for an informant from Bangju. Soken looked at the piece of paper, admitting that he had been worried since they had lost contact after what happened to Kim, to which the man thought that it looked like the insider that the agency director was supposed to contact had also died along with Kim. He looked closely at Soken, who was saying that they had agreed to help with the escape, so he wanted to catch these guys as well, so he had already prepared a persona for him from that side. The director also said that they were too busy dealing with the Myeongdong incident to pay attention to the hunter who suddenly appeared, and he only knew that the guy's last name was Wu, so he decided to give him a temporary name, and after saying this, Hui hunched over a little, thinking that everything was going well because it explained why his background was unclear. But he didn't want to rush because he knew that the agency director didn't trust him very much, since there were some doubts. He heard the question about whether he should be called Wu Hui, to which he agreed, and he himself thought that he was also from Bangju and an insider, so it was not a lie and there was no risk of exposure either. Seokyeon moved closer to the table, saying that he would be working under him for a while, and Hui immediately clarified whether it was for surveillance, to which the director replied that the man could think so, since it was impossible to let him go so freely. Soken extended his hand and said that he was looking forward to working with the man anyway. Hui looked at the smiling director and thought about how she had started working for him even though he was not the director of the agency or his adoptive father yet. They shook hands and Hui said that he was glad too. Hui sat there looking gloomy. Soken moved closer to him in his chair and asked how he was doing, if everything was okay with his stay here, to which the man asked how he could be okay if he was stuck in a place like this for a whole week. The director was indignant, reminding him that he visited him every day and wasn't that great, to which the man immediately showed his leg, on which there was a bracelet saying that he was being treated like a prisoner, and this bracelet was like geo handcuffs. Soken smiled and said that there was no need to be so negative, then suggested that he should see something good in it, because he managed to escape and was now free. Besides, the man said that he wanted to achieve a lot. Hui reminded him that it was Soken who wanted to do a lot, to which he folded his arms and asked to be called uncle. Hui looked at the interlocutor indifferently when he asked him to remember the 5 children he saved in Myeongdong. He explained that they were his students, and immediately Hui thought that Soken did not hear this news right away, so perhaps he passed the test. Soken smiled carefree, saying that he heard that it was Hui who lured out the minotaurs and thanks to him they dealt with them so easily. Soken admitted that otherwise the damage would have been much more serious, to which Hui thought that this was how it was explained. Hui smiled contentedly when Soken said that he was curious about where all the cows came from, but the main thing was that the result was good and the children were okay, to which the man said that nothing bad happened. Soken said that he thought about something, and Hui immediately became wary since the results of the headmaster's thoughts were never good. Soken thoughtfully rubbed his chin, saying that he knew the skill level of his students better than anyone, so it would be difficult even if it was only them, but the man also saved the civilians, so everyone would be dead if it weren't for him. He took out an envelope, saying that his students were all crying, asking him to find HWE, and since he felt the need to repay him for what he did, he decided to think for a while, to which HWE immediately became wary of the headmaster thinking so much. Soken handed the contract to the man and asked him to teach the students. He looked at HWE intently, saying that he would be too conspicuous if he followed him around the dungeons, but if he worked as a teacher, it would be a good cover. HWE looked at the contract with confusion and asked again if the director wanted him to teach the children. He thought about the school and how just by looking at the agency director, one could understand how deep the bond between a student and a master was, because there were several people, including Gina's of the Hunter School, who considered the agency director their teacher, and they would have done just fine on their own, but they voluntarily came to the agency to be on his leash, and if he established a good relationship with them, they would ensure his future after saving the world. HWE thought that it would be foolish of him to reveal what he was thinking right now, so the man asked out loud what he could teach the children even if he couldn't use mana. And if it was just about how to fight, then Soken was the best candidate, and then he looked at the principal intently. He frowned and explained that it was because it was easy to teach children how to fight, but the problem was with magic. He smirked, saying that it was about the runes that concealed a man's mana. HWE tensed up when he heard the question about whether he had made them himself, and then thought that was why he should have just kept quiet. Instead, he asked if Soken wanted him to teach the children the runes, to which the director replied that he didn't care whether he had made them himself or not, he just needed to know about other runes like this. HWE planted his feet firmly on the floor, thinking that he had hoped to teach the children how to go into the dungeons, but now it would be suspicious if an illegal awakened who had recently escaped from a secluded organization knew much about it. HWE jumped up, pointed a finger at the principal, saying that firstly, runes are not magic, to which Soken retorted that they can be very useful for children, to which HWE said that he is not the one who is suitable for teaching. However, the principal believed that the man would be an ideal teacher. HWE immediately fell silent, thinking about what he just wanted to tell him that he was the one who made them and patent them, although perhaps that would be too immoral. He rolled his eyes, thinking that even if he did not patent them, they saved many lives, and if he spread the knowledge about them, he would not be able to find and save every hunter personally, so if he told the public about these runes, it would be more useful. Soken suddenly laughed and said that he was going to do this anyway. HWE took a pen and said that he was doing it for the children. He started reading the contract. The director said that he had taken care of certified copies and a bank account that he would give back later, and he called it a school, but it was run by his own money, so he would be listed as a guild member. Suddenly, some points made the man read more carefully, while Soken said that since he hadn't raided the dungeons, he had no other incentive, so he simply determined his monthly salary based on the minimum wage. Pleased with himself, Soken said that during the 3-month probationary period, the man would only receive 90% of that amount, and as for vacation, it should be noted that they had less than 5 people. But they still took time off on holidays, and the children sometimes called them to train even on those days, but the man was free to decide for himself whether to go or not. HWE squeezed the contract in anger, saying that he had been deceived. 2 days later, while they were driving in the car, Soken said that HWE's sword was very good. Soken drove and talked about how the sword also recognizes its owner and it sends enemies straight to the hospital, then asked if it belonged to HWE, to which the man immediately said that it belonged to someone he knew, and the director immediately asked if HWE stole it. But he admitted that if he did, it would have burned too. Then he looked back at the back seat where the sword was lying and thought that this sword used to hate him, but apparently he knew that Jiyeon gave it to him before she died. Soken glanced at the passenger and asked if he was angry that he did not return the weapon. HWE said that even if Soken returned it, he wouldn't be able to use it because of the mana-limiting device, so the principal thought that HWE was angry at him, but Soken quickly assured him that he wasn't. Soken smirked and said that blades were banned at his school, so he wouldn't be able to use it either, although it wasn't like his classes required weapons. And HWE replied that the principal could just say that he didn't want a suspicious person with a weapon around his students. HWE turned to the window when he heard the question about why he was so pessimistic, and thought to himself that the principal didn't even deny it. Suddenly, something piqued his interest. He asked if they were going the right way when he saw the field and the ease in front of him, so he thought that the school's surroundings were as urban as it could be, but not that rural, so he doubted that he was going to the right place. Soken explained with a smile on his face that it was because there were dungeons nearby, so it was the perfect place to raise hunters. Finally, the car stopped. There were some strange buildings around, so HWE was unsure if it was really a school, to which Soken agreed that it looked sloppy. HWE was taken aback because he thought it wasn't sloppy and there was almost nothing here, but the principal explained that they would build a building next year, so this setup was temporary. Hui was sad because he realized that he would have to teach the kids here until next year, but Soken believed that the path to the top had to start somewhere. He clenched his fist and smiled encouragingly, then welcomed Hui to the hunter school. He later introduced Hui to the class as the RN teacher. He said that he knew some of the students had seen him before but they shouldn't be too rough with him, and several students raised their hands to ask a question, but Soken was the first to ask Hyunwook. The boy wondered if Hui used a sword instead of magic, to which Soken replied that you don't have to be a mage to use runes, and it was hard to convince a man to be their teacher. To which another student immediately asked if they would be learning runes that hide mana or new ones. Soken replied that they would be new runes and it should be very useful for these students specifically, so he asked them not to fall asleep during class, to which the boy said that it sounded great but it was strange to him that Hui would be teaching them. The principal immediately asked if he wouldn't teach them if it wasn't good and didn't want to learn runes, to which the boy smiled sheepishly and said that he did. The two in the back row leaned to the side to get a better look at the teacher and then asked about the fact that only mages could participate in this lesson. Soken shook his head and said that it was not so, but those two were the only ones who could draw runes, but their school was flexible so she could join in too if she wanted. Finally, Sonen could not stand it anymore, since he had been trying to get attention all this time. He asked if the teacher had gotten hurt after that incident, and the students immediately began to ask why Hui had just left, since they were worried about him. Hui looked in surprise at the worried children, who said that they had asked the teacher to sort it out, but he hadn't told them anything, and besides, they thought something had happened to him. Hui smiled as he thought about how these kind and innocent ducklings were so different from the hunters they would become in 20 years, and he remembered the thought that if he died, it would be his fault and what he left behind would be his. But if he lived, it would be because of him, so whatever he earned would be like his, since that was the attitude of the world. Hui looked at Soken and thought about how the person that the squad member had punched the entire dungeon and who had ended up dying was one of these guys. He looked closely at the students. He was interested in Soan, who was currently sitting at her desk with a detached expression because she had been normal the last time he saw her, and it had only been 9 days since the Myeongdong incident, so how did she become the witch he knew? He thought back to April 5, 2024 in the Myeongdong dungeon when someone called out to Seoan to look at the rune that was drawn. The girl immediately said that she didn't think the line should be that long. The girl heard that it was so difficult, but she did it so easily, to which she replied that her grandfather taught her when she was little. Seoan asked the guy to draw the Hyunwook rune and she would draw the Sonyeon, but he asked if the girl was tired and assured her that he could handle it. Seoan smiled and told her classmate not to worry since she had a lot of experience as a mage, so he shouldn't overwork himself since they would still need the guy's shield, and now Seoan was thinking about what her grandfather said, arrogance ruins everything. She remembered the guy crying because of the horror he had experienced, and everyone realized that the rune on Seonyang had not worked. The girl kept replaying that moment in her head and convincing herself that everyone got out alive thanks to her, but she also remembered the words about how arrogance ruins everything. The girl bit her finger until it hurt. The two employees flinched when they saw Seoyeon's gloomy look. Both guys turned around and left when the girl looked at them. Hyunwook suddenly entered the hall and asked Seoyeon what she was doing there. An exhausted Seoyeon shook her head, greeting Hyunwook, who looked at her and asked if she was waiting for Mr. Hong. Suddenly, the protagonist bumped into Hyunwook, telling him to get out of the way. Shaking off his shoulder, he told Hyunwook that he had not called them for chatting. As the boy and girl stared at him, the protagonist introduced himself as an assistant from the joint dungeon raid headquarters. Hyunwook narrowed his eyes in doubt. Seeing this, Hui said that his job was to support the director of the agency and assess the safety of all existing dungeons in South Korea. The protagonist closed his eyes and barely contained his anger when Hyunwook said that he was talking complete nonsense. The events take us to the hotel. Soken was leaving, telling the protagonist to temporarily stay at the hotel. Closing the door, the man smiled at the guy, wishing him a good night. Crossing his legs, the protagonist mentally said that when he was young, he did not understand why they had to study technology. With one click, the guy removed the electronic bracelet. Activating the hologram of the watch, the protagonist said that the director was right. Entering one of the sites, the protagonist thought he did not know what he should check first, whether he should check the history of the group that caught Soken or the records of Kim. Suddenly his hand froze. The protagonist abruptly started typing, looking for information about Seoyeon. Hui stared at the list of websites on the hologram. He wanted to know what exactly changed the girl's personality. A moment later, the guy narrowed his eyes and froze. The protagonist involuntarily remembered the girl's smile when he read that she did not like being praised. He assumed that she was smiling because he clapped her. The protagonist's hand froze when he read some rules for communicating with Seoyeon. The first rule said to move away from Seoyeon if she did not smile. There was also advice that if there was an emergency, it was better to call Hyunwook. The protagonist screamed in confusion, raising his hands. He did not understand what the problem was this time. After all, he saved everyone. Poking at the watch, the guy calmed down. Suddenly, the protagonist froze when he saw Seoyeon's article. The hologram showed the name of the research center and the date of the article. The next day, the protagonist came to a spacious clearing, mentally cursing, saying that although he was called so early, the man himself did not show up. Not paying attention to the guy who came, HWE thought that there really was nothing here. The guy closed his eyes and frowned, not believing that they needed to develop this place and build a new building here. He involuntarily thought about giving up and just living in luxury thanks to the knowledge of the future. A moment later, he opened his eyes wide, wanting to find a way to survive. Sonen's sudden scream made the protagonist tremble all over. The frightened protagonist leaned to the side a little. Sonen, standing in front of him, asked what he was thinking about. Smiling widely, the guy asked HWE if he remembered him. When the protagonist looked away, Sonen asked him where his sword was, then he told him about his aunt who was interested in this sword. Thoughtfully, the protagonist imagined a girl with golden hair. It was the youngest daughter of the chairman of the Dean Group and the guild master of the Dasan Guild, Nseong. Clenching his fist, Sonen happily told HWE that his aunt would like to meet him. The protagonist turned around when Soken came in and asked him to come to him. Entering the room, HWE asked the man what happened to him. He said with a smile that he was preparing an office for him. Picking up one of the boxes, Soken said that they used this room as a storage room. The protagonist sighed, realizing that the man would not clean here. Looking at the window, he told Soken to think of something they could do with Soan. The girl sat with her legs pressed to her chest. She looked completely different than when the protagonist saw her in Myeongdal. Soken nodded, saying that every hunter hits a wall at some point. Sohan had long since awakened, so it was her time. The protagonist turned away, feeling horrified and ashamed. Seeing Soken showing his muscles and smiling, the protagonist mentally said that this guy was too hopeless, because he was too confident in himself, be it physically or mentally. The protagonist seemed to be a person in space far from Soken. The problems of normal people would be incomprehensible to Soken. The sun's rays broke through the window while the protagonist thought about the modern strategy of dungeons divided into O, and after the revaluation of runes. Runes were neglected for a long time due to several fatal flaws, but after one mage discovered the RNA of hiding mana, everything changed. Despite the shortcomings, everyone began to study runes, and around 2040, everyone began to draw runes. Even pens for mana were created. The protagonist closed his eyes, saying that they must create a way to obtain mana. Seoken smiled widely and told the protagonist to continue the lesson. Hyun raised her hand, saying that they would also be silent. The protagonist, seeing this, mentally said that they should not have come to the rune class at all. Smiling, the protagonist raised his hand, telling the students that they would evaluate their level today. Jinwoo nervously drew a pencil on the notebook. The protagonist stood up on the trembling guy and asked him if he had ruined everything again. Jinwoo, trembling with fear, said that the runes should work even with such a deviation. Taking the paper in his hand, the protagonist asked the guy if he knew why runes were not used in the past. Straightening up, Jinwoo said that it was all because magic was much easier to use. Hearing the answer, HWE asked the reason for this. Jinwoo heard the question and grabbed his head, not knowing the answer. Seoken broke the pencil when the protagonist asked her the same question. Trembling with his whole body, HWE asked the girl why runes were not used so often. Seeing the girl bow her head, HWE almost cried and did not move aside. Unexpectedly, a moment later, the protagonist was already near the board. The girl answered him, saying that it was all because the runes were easily erased. Taking a pencil in his hand, the protagonist said that this is especially true for dungeons where the mana in the air is distorted. Starting to draw a rune, the protagonist said that he is not a mage, so there is no point in asking him about the principle of action. A couple of students looked at the board carefully without moving. A few seconds later, the runes of durability, correction, waterproofness, amplification, and resonance were drawn on the board. The protagonist turned around, saying that this combination will not allow the rune to be easily erased. If the first rune drawn is even slightly incorrect, it will not activate. The guy suddenly froze when Soan asked him why he did not teach them this in Myeongdal. The girl looked away and laughed, saying that she had drawn the runes incorrectly and they had not worked. The girl had been drawing runes day after day. Bad results and papers were immediately thrown away due to her impulsiveness. Smiling, Soan picked up the paper, asking if the runes would work this time. Not hearing an answer, the girl lowered the paper. Tears appeared in her eyes as she said that she could not ruin it. The protagonist clapped his hands, mentally saying that the girl's condition might not even be his fault. Smiling at the children, he told them that it was already lunchtime and they should go eat. The protagonist sat sadly at the table. He never thought that he would eat a store-bought lunch in a container. Soken, not understanding, did not ask if he had made the runes himself since he understood them so well. The protagonist pressed his hand to his chest, feeling heartburn, and asked if they should talk about this even while eating. Picking up his spoon, HWE said that the runes were made by one of his acquaintances. Chewing his food, the boy glanced at the man, realizing that he was still suspicious of him. He closed his eyes, mentally telling Soken not to know much about the inner workings of the ARC research facility. Opening his eyes, the boy said that it would be wasteful to let such knowledge disappear. Soken froze for a moment, staring at the boy, and told him to forget what he said. As the man put food in his mouth, the protagonist asked him how he taught students magic. He answered by saying that he simply finds all the available books he can find. Remembering the children, HWE said that Seoan has magic that she learned from her grandfather, and Jinwoo, although he had talent, had difficulty finding a suitable master for it. Smiling, Soken asked the boy if he happened to know someone suitable for this. The protagonist once again reminded him that he is not a mage. The man nodded to himself, saying that he just wanted to make sure. The man's mouth suddenly opened wide in shock and froze when the protagonist said that he would teach the children all the runes he knew. Taking the roll of tissues in his hand, HWE told the man that he would still have to publish all the runes he knew when the time came. Reaching out for the roll, a shocked Soken asked if he was sure about publishing the runes they made in the ARC. The protagonist narrowed his eyes and asked if he thought he would ask them for gold and riches for asking for teaching. The man replied saying that he thought he would just teach them 1 or 2 runes. Thinking and imagining the children, the protagonist said that at first he just wanted to teach them a couple of runes and end it, but seeing the state of these children, it became clear to him that they would all die soon. Frowning, Soken asked if the mage had given permission to teach others his runes. The protagonist sitting opposite said that the mage was one of those who were happy if his work saved at least one life. It was a mage from France who created a hand of concealing mana. Even when those who were late earned astronomical sums, the blonde wanted to save as many people as possible. The public his runes for free for everyone. Soken frowned when the protagonist said that he had one condition, namely that he knew of a place where there were many children and he needed them to go there. The protagonist remembered the case of his younger self. He was going to save himself a year earlier. The events take us to a vast meadow. Soken smiled widely, telling the student that he had lost his balance. With one blow, he threw Hyunwook away from himself. The guy jumped up and rushed forward in anger. While he was running, his partner was striking the teacher from behind. The man deftly wielded the pole, parrying and striking the students. Hyunwook soon began to emit flames of anger due to the teacher's constant ridicule. Jinwoo grabbed his head, saying that he had made a mistake again. The protagonist opened his eyes, mentally saying that they were all still children. HWE leaned over Seo-eun and asked her if she was drawing in the order she was told, then asked her to let him see if she was doing it correctly, to which she refused. She leaned over her work, hiding it, then said that she would show it later when she could draw better. And at that moment the man thought that if she was unsure of herself because of her mistakes, he could help her by praising her. But what could he do if she did not show him her work at all? HWE stood up straight and said loudly that his role was to help the students become better, but Seo-eun insisted on showing his work later. HWE looked at Seo-eun worriedly and said that it would be bad if they got into a bad habit, so he wanted to check. He smiled, thinking that he should encourage his students, but he didn't understand how he should do it because he didn't know how it was done before. He remembered how in his past life, he was praised by people saying that there used to be a few hunters with unique ideas like him, and they would always ask him if he knew what happened to them, after which they would immediately answer that their corpses were found. They would also ask him if this was all he could come up with, then they would mockingly say that he was a genius, and since he thought he was so smart, he should be applauded, so HWE grabbed his head because it didn't inspire him at all. Soken's voice was heard encouraging one of the students, saying that he could do it faster. HWE looked at Soken with a sigh and remembered how in his past life he praised HWE for coming in second place in the entire school. At that time, the principal looked at the certificate, saying that such a person could also come from their family, so he didn't need to worry about sending him to a public middle school. At that time, Soken noticed his son's state and said that he was doing well, so he didn't understand what was with his expression. His face suddenly changed to a smiling one when he learned that HWE wanted to be in first place because it was normal, but he didn't care even if he was in last place. The principal said that it didn't matter, then asked if the boy was going to go to college, after which he assured him that everything would work out as he wanted, because Soken himself would let him do whatever he wanted no matter what. HWE sighed and said that he understood everything, so he told the girl to do what she wanted, but to show him when she was ready. A little later, HWE got into Soken's car and asked if the house was close, to which Soken replied that it was not, but they had a place nearby that they could use as a dormitory, to which the man was surprised that they were sending these children to such a school. The sun was setting, beautifully reflecting in the windows of the houses, when a voice sounded in the yard that it was sad to hear, but recently there have been more cases of child abductions. The car was driving along the road, when it sounded that usually the victims are awakened children, and they do not even ask for ransom. Besides, the witnesses do not care, so the children are abducted in the middle of a large street in broad daylight. Soken frowned at Hui and said that the place the man mentioned, where there were many children, is the Ark Research Center. Hui immediately looked at the director and asked if he thought that all the children in the Ark were kidnapped. Hui explained that among the places the Ark controlled were orphanages, and he could count the ones he knew on one hand. So he was sure that there were many that were controlled in the dark, so his condition was that Soken save all these children, but still allow him to participate in the operation. Soken frowned, asking if the man understood that he had made many concessions for him. Hui smiled and asked the man to calm down, then asked if Soken was just going to take the children and be done with it, and if he was going to look around the famous Ark research facilities. Soken glanced in the rearview mirror and said that the current search parties already had enough members, but Hui was sure that they lacked people who could hack the security of the Ark research facilities, and he was also interested in what the concept he had in mind was. Hui explained that he needed to find someone, namely a person who was willing to put his life on the line to save the children, and he was also interested in whether the child was safe. The two men fell silent. Soken closed his eyes and finally made up his mind, saying that they would need a guide. He looked at the road and said that he would take some time, since he needed to gather some useful guys, to which Hui immediately asked if they could be trusted, after which Soken immediately became indignant, asking who they thought he was. The director chuckled, saying that he did not joke when it came to children. The sky was clear that day. Hui looked out the window while the kids were writing something in the classroom, and he thought about how Soyeon was gloomy as usual and Jinwoo was assessing the situation in the room. Sunyeon called Hui, and the man immediately discouraged the guy by saying that he was always grateful to him. Sunyeon introduced Sungjin, to which Hui greeted the students and asked if they had classes. Sunyeon said that they were strange because they didn't even have a lunch break, to which Hui said that they shortened their breaks at their own request. Sunyeon immediately noted that it was because they were magicians, and he himself could not sit in one place for a long time, to which the man immediately asked if he was a swordsman. The guy wanted to know where his teacher's sword was, to which he replied that the principal told him not to carry weapons in school. Sonon admitted that he wanted to take a closer look, and the man thought that if there was a second Hui here, then there was a second Jeon sword. So if there were two swords with such characteristics, even if it was not his main weapon, it was still very tempting. The sound of screeching tires was heard from the car braking too hard. The door swung open and a graceful woman's leg appeared from the car. Soken's voice was heard greeting the woman, to which she was indignant that she was not told that the roads were so broken. She adjusted her sunglasses and said that she would have taken another car, to which Hui wondered why Archmage Eamon was here, because to put it bluntly, this had never happened before and could not happen now. The system reported that Eamon is an S rank. She is a druid archmage, works as a teacher, but does not have personal students. Her unique magic is the 3rd level Blooming Pink Vine on July 9, 2027. She was killed while fighting a siren, and at that moment the woman sighed and said that she appreciated the offer, but she thought that the only thing she could teach the children was the basics of using mana. Keeman looked at the students and said that her magic required high compatibility, so she didn't think these students had the ability to do it, to which Soken asked if the woman could evaluate and speak at once, but Keeman thought that at her level she could do it. She looked at Soyeon and asked if this was the same granddaughter of Nojin, and if so, she probably already knew the basics, but the student had no experience. Keeman was indignant, realizing that she was called in specifically for evaluation, although they said it would be related to the Ark, to which Soken said that it was not entirely unrelated. Finally, Keeman noticed Hui and pointed her finger at him, exclaiming that this was the man who was on the roof and then taken away. Hui bowed with a smile and introduced himself, saying that he was a teacher of the mage students. Yeoman exclaimed in surprise at Hui being a mage, because she remembered seeing him with a sword in Myeongdong. Soken chuckled and replied that the man was not a mage, but that he knew something better, and the woman immediately asked if it was unique magic. Hui smiled again and explained that he taught runes, and thought to himself that it was amazing that he had the opportunity to meet Archmage Yeeman, so he was grateful. Yeeman looked confused, and began to talk about how she and Soken might not know the nuances. Hui asked if the woman thought runes were trash, but she waved her hands, saying that she would not go that far, but Hui thought it would be faster to show, and then asked the students to bring the drawn runes. The children brought their drawings and Hui said that Jinwoo needed to make this part longer, so he shouldn't let it become a habit. Seoan heard her say that she did a good job because her level of execution was getting better, but like he said in the morning, she needed to be more confident in the lines. Yeeman grabbed the drawings and started saying that this rune was a difficult thing, to which Hui said that all the final versions had passed, and then offered to check them. He placed a piece of paper on the floor and filled it with mana. Fire immediately burst out of the paper. Seoan nervously fiddled with her paper. Suddenly, a heavy rain began to pour down, and Hui asked for another piece of paper. Yeeman watched the rune magic with delight. However, the woman did not sense mana, so she was interested in how Hui did it. The man approached his students and happily praised them for their good work, since even the Archmage could not detect mana. He showed a crumpled piece of paper and said that this is the power of the rune that hides mana. Yimin looked at the drawings with all her might and said that it was the first time she saw such a rune, and the intersecting lines gave it a different function, so she thought that the rune worked fine without destroying it, to which Soken explained that Hui said that he learned it from a familiar mage. Yimin smiled slyly and asked to accept a new student. She grabbed Soken by the lapels and asked if she could learn this rune. She continued to shake the director, saying that she did not need a salary or anything like that. She just needed to be allowed to take the rune class, to which Soken asked contentedly if he could really do that. Yimin turned to Hui and said that he could just draw the rune for her, and Soken asked him to do it, which greatly angered the man. The woman smiled contentedly, saying that she would be under his supervision. However, Hui was not happy with this turn of events because he wanted to at least get his salary. A few days later, on May 15, 2024, outside one of the laboratories, Hui asked Soken who all the people were whose movements were similar to hunters. The director explained that they were employees of a reliable person, to which the man said that they were not very trustworthy, and Soken explained that when it came to such things, they were very meticulous. Soken turned to the man and said that the goal was to confirm the presence of children, so they would open an escape route, and if they could, they would receive important information, and it would also prevent anyone from being caught from the higher ranks, so once they were done, they would send a signal and cause chaos. Hui asked in confusion if the director had said that they had to do everything themselves, to which he replied that it was all improvisation. One of the men turned around and said that his device had detected nothing because there were no life forms here except for bugs, and there were no surveillance cameras either. Hui muttered in shock that this couldn't be. He straightened up and suggested that they go inside. Soken asked him to wait, but at that moment the chains holding the door fell to the floor. Soken reminded the man entering the building that he was wearing a mana blocker and then asked him what he was doing. Hui thought that something was wrong, because the criminals shouldn't have figured it out that easily because of the children. Because this experiment requires a specific environment, and they create a sterile environment that doesn't allow outsiders to interfere. He walked over to the control panel and started entering numbers. He pressed the buttons one by one, when finally the sound of authorization complete sounded. Soken asked about what the code was just then, and then got indignant that Hui could have said earlier, but Hui replied that he also needed secrets. They entered the elevator and Soken saw Hui dialing the 5th floor, and then noted that it was quite high, but Hui said that it was the opposite, since they were going to the lowest floor, the basement. The elevator doors slammed shut. However, there was nothing in the basement either, and Hui muttered in frustration that they couldn't have known that he was coming. He stopped his partners and warned them not to use magic, because otherwise the emergency protocol would be activated, because since they left the room, they had prepared for any intrusions. Besides, I think they called it Project Pompey. Hui continued to explain that they had drawn runes in hidden places that would react to mana activation, to which Yimin immediately asked if he could do something like that. The man turned on the flashlight and walked forward, thinking that judging by the lack of dust, it was likely that they had left for a long time and were planning to return, so this place had definitely been in operation for 2 years before Soken attacked it. So he wondered what had changed in the ark if everyone had escaped in the middle of the night. The next door was locked. Soken heard that this was the main research lab, and if they went inside, they would see a room where the most important research materials were supposed to be. However, the room was empty and Hui didn't expect that they had actually cleaned it. Yimin noticed that there were children's toys in there. They were scattered everywhere. Soken asked just in case if there were runes that would activate when the object was destroyed, to which Hui replied that there shouldn't be any. At that moment, the wall exploded into stone chips. Soken smashed the glass in anger. Hui was impressed and thought that no matter from the outside or the inside, this place was always geo-impressive. Hui thought back to when he was still a child at the Ark Research Center, then he asked one of the children what he was writing. He was told that it was a diary entry because his father was a lawyer, and he said that evidence was important in such cases. Hui asked the boy to write about the head of the lab beating children, to which he objected that such things do not happen, but Hui reminded the little ones that he beats the lab employees. Then the boy wrote that the head of the lab beats people, which was not a lie. The woman sighed in irritation. Guildmaster Dasen, the youngest daughter of the owner of the Dean Group, Aunt Sonan angrily asked about it being a waste of time. Hui thought about how this woman looked the same as in the future, and Soken said with a smile that it was not a waste of time, but the research center arc. The woman said that she would not call it a waste of time if there were the remaining research data here, but this was not what she was promised, and it was not good, after which the woman sneezed violently. The hunter who ran up said that he had removed all the explosives, and the woman said that this was great news. She smiled, folded her arms across her chest, and said that since Soken was talking to her in the most indirect way, He still must be hiding something from her. She wondered what it was, but Soken just smiled at her silently. He looked at Hui thoughtfully. The woman exhaled, as if she had realized something. She waved her hand and said that they needed to talk, so she asked her guards to go and do their business or check. There was nothing useful, to which the hunters immediately agreed. Soken turned to the approaching Kim and asked if she was finished. Well, the woman agreed. The youngest daughter of the owner of the group was indignant, since she was recently told that there was nothing left, but Soken corrected her, saying that nothing was left from the lab workers. He handed her the papers and said that this was left by a child who was kidnapped. Hui listened with a calm face. That more precisely, this was his younger brother. The woman looked at the paper and asked again about her brother in surprise. She began to leaf through the notes. On one of the sheets was the date April 5th. It was written that apparently the Mendong dungeon was a failure, but the writer did not know what this had to do with them, since he did not even know where Mendong was, and he wanted them to fix the TV that was broken. The woman read the recording in horror, asking out loud what it was and whether the Myeongdong dungeon was a failure, after which she began to read again about how the laboratories had been moved. Although the writers did not know why, but he heard the chief say that the dungeon that appeared in the Songpa area had appeared and that someone must have escaped. 2 days later, Songjin was sitting in school sadly. Hui approached her. He asked her if the girl was watching the ants. Hui wanted to ask how things were, but the girl did not want to talk. He was worried and continued to look at the girl. She was sad, and he could not forget her name, but if he did not remember her, it meant that she left early or died. Hui asked why she was here alone and letting Songyeon fight alone, but the girl replied that this was the plan. Seongjin explained that they couldn't defeat Hyunwook even if they teamed up with him, and Hui thought that was true, period. He looked at the boy fighting and thought that he had a lot of potential, even compared to Seoyeon. He silently watched the students and thought that the others were normal. Suddenly, the girl asked if the teacher could stop looking at the students. At first, he didn't understand what happened, and then he smiled. He looked at Seoyeon and asked whose idea it was, but she answered that it was Seongyeon's. Hyunwook lunged. Seoyeon watched him. Seongyeon bowed. He grabbed the wooden sword more comfortably. The boy's movements became blurred. The boy rushed to attack. Seoyeon hit Hyunwook, and he fell to the ground. Hyunwook began to curse at Seoyeon. The girl said that it was a shame. Hyunwook started to scold them for cheating, but he was immediately asked if he didn't remember what the teacher said. Sunny reminded him with a satisfied smile that you never know what can happen in the dungeon. Hyunwook thought this was incredible. He was like Sunny suggested that he team up with someone if he was angry. A black car pulled up to the school. The students immediately turned around and began to look at the hunters leaving. The teachers immediately approached the students to see who had arrived, and Sunny recognized the aunt. The woman got out of the car with a smile and asked how her nephew was doing. The guy irritably reminded her that he asked her not to call him that in public, but the woman turned to Sajin and said that she had become so beautiful. The girl was embarrassed and said that she had trained a lot. Auntie Seonyoung sighed and said that it was good that she left them with Seokin because she wanted their little brother to look up to the girl. She then addressed Hyunwook, saying that he had grown taller since the last time she saw him. Then Jejia suggested that the boy join their guild and that she would treat him well as an elder. Seonyoung grumbled that she was not an elder, but an old woman. The woman turned to her nephew with a sweet smile and said that this was why he didn't have a girlfriend. She decided to remind her nephew of the name of the girl from elementary school. Despite all his attempts to stop him, the woman continued that if he had listened to her advice, he wouldn't have been rejected. The aunt pretended to be sad and asked if her nephew knew that his parents were also in love with each other and everyone in their family finds love easily. So she didn't know what was wrong with the guy, to which Sunyeon said it was because he was like her. The woman got angry and said that she was lonely for quitting her job and he was lonely for rejecting, but Sunyeon said that everyone said that. Hui watched their squabble in confusion, thinking about what he heard that Miseong loved her nephew very much. He watched the relatives squabble and thought that they hoped they would be more cordial, but this is quite ordinary and perhaps this means that they are close. Finally, Seokin came out of the pavilion and was surprised that she was there, after which she said that Sunyeon's aunt brought food and offered to eat. Seokin called Hui and Kiman. Myeon revealed over a cup of tea that she had purchased the Songpa dungeon in Banggi-do, although she thought that the government might take over the dungeon due to the Myeongdong dungeon incident. The woman kept the cup and said that thanks to that, other guilds were hesitant to bid, so she didn't have to pay much for it, so the estimated rank of the dungeon also went down. Soken folded her arms and asked if there was an official evaluation, to which the woman replied that due to the Myeongdong dungeon being out of service the day before, the evaluation of the rank was delayed, so she didn't think anyone had entered it. Soken looked at her comrade and suggested that in that case they should try to get into the dungeon as soon as possible because the problem was in the Myeongdong dungeon. To which Kiman asked if Hui knew what his brother meant by writing in the diary that they failed. The man hesitated and answered in the negative since he had no idea. This was because he had never written it in the past. The next day came. Hui took the cap off his marker and said what they would do today. Standing in front of the board, he added that since the students had to get used to the mana concealment runes and support runes, and that he planned to teach them a new rune. At that moment a student raised her hand and addressed the teacher. The protagonist, smirking slightly, asked what her question was. Blowing up a bubblegum balloon, Miss-on thought that the protagonist was handsome, but she could not trust him. The student who raised her hand asked how many runes he knew. Miss-on thought about how their junior hunter and Hunter Hong were not particularly warlike. The protagonist, with his mouth slightly open, asked Yimin why she was interested in this. She asked him that it was natural for a student to be interested in the master's skills. Hui, with his eyes narrowed, told her not to say anything so scary, because he was not a mage and did not sign a contract and he should not be called a mage. Miss-on, gritting her teeth, thought about how the guy from the Ark laboratory saved the students and that they called him kind-hearted and that it was very suspicious. The whole class looked at her. Miss-on, embarrassed and covering her mouth with her hand, said that it was just a habit and she did not want to interrupt. An approving response was heard from the class. After drawing an intricate rune on the board, Hui said that today he would teach them the shadow rune, as he liked to call it. Beaming with admiration, he said how easy it was, and a phrase was heard from the class that the hero said this very confidently. Yimin, jumping up from her chair, asked about the effect of this rune and why he couldn't just tell. The teacher calmly said that the students should just try to draw it, since there was nothing interesting in the story. The protagonist said that the students should just draw it. The students agreed. Everyone very diligently draws the rune on sheets of paper. Hui, leaning over Jinwoo, said that this rune is much simpler than the mana concealment rune. The student nodded his head in approval. The hero reproached the student that this rune is simple, and he should know how to draw it right away and he still has a lot of runes to learn. Jinwoo, already on the edge, reacted negatively to the teacher's words. Hui said that he should draw a support rune. Miss-on was still sitting at the back of the class. It was heard that the hero turned to So-eun to check how she drew the rune. He, looking at the student's sheet, said that she drew the rune well and added that it needs to be checked. Looking at her sheet of paper, he said that the student should activate the rune. Miss-on, wide-eyed, could not understand what was wrong with her vision. She said that her vision was becoming strange, as So-eun's silhouette was becoming blurry. The teacher, taking the sheet from the student, said that this rune synchronizes the user with the shadows and when it is light it does not seem like anything special. Tearing the paper into pieces, he added that when it gets dark, the effect of the rune can be dramatic, and So-eun, opening her mouth, exclaimed in amazement. The teacher, crumpling the paper, asked the student about how she can use this rune, but she, a little confused, said that she did not know. The hero, opening his mouth wide, said that there is nothing wrong with not knowing it and that he did not want to pressure her with this question, and he added that they can study together quietly, because that is why he is here. Because of this, So-eun began to apologize. The protagonist, raising his hands, said that everything is fine. At this moment, from the class, they heard that someone had a question. Miss-on, slightly opening her mouth, asked the protagonist about the mana concealment rune that he spoke about earlier. Hui, slightly tilting his head, said that this rune conceals mana, as the name suggests. Ranks. From the classroom, the teacher could be heard saying that Sun Joan was supposed to have told her that he had used this rune to save the students in Myeongdong. Miss-on widened her eyes and said that she hadn't heard anything about runes from him. Turning to Soken, she said that their youngest and Hunter kept changing the topic and she didn't ask what happened because she was afraid that Seon-young might develop an injury. Soken looked at her in surprise. She opened her mouth in a fit of rage and said that he had already silenced her nephew and asked what happened. The family tree of the Yeoman family appeared. 3 generations of this family have been mages with the same attribute, which is a rare case even at the international level, and despite the lack of experience as a mage, the family's reputation as a family of mages is more than enough. The man in front of Hui, passing the glass, asked if the hero understood what he meant. The protagonist asked what this had to do with the collar. Soken, frowning slightly, asked him if he understood what he said to Hui, to which the hero said that the collar had nothing to do with it. He added that he didn't know. The man opposite said that the Hui rune was something that a mage from such a prestigious family had vouched for and that he would now be hunted by mages and pursuers of the Ark. The hero, sipping from a glass, said that they should simply announce it with the name Kimen and then he would end it, to which Soken exclaimed. He, with his eyes narrowed in anger, told Hui that he shouldn't live like that. The protagonist couldn't understand what he was talking about. Squinting, Soken said that it was the hero's merit and the merit of that mage. Hui still couldn't understand what he was talking about. He asked the hero if the protagonist really thought that he had silenced the students, to which Hui, with a calm face, said no. Soken asked him why none of them told their family about it, and immediately added that it was because they also knew that the hero's rune would forever remain in history. The protagonist, opening his mouth in surprise, exclaimed, The hero felt ashamed that he clutched his heart. The man added that he did not need to worry about anything, and that he would make sure that Hui's name entered the book of history. All those mages whose achievements he was taking for himself right now, the achievements of the French mage and the shadow rune Soan, as well as the achievements of other mages who created useful runes, popped up in the protagonist's mind. He also remembered the images of all those people who took astronomical amounts of money. Hui, lowering his head into his hands, could not say anything. He, covering his face with his hands, thought that the Frenchmen and so on did not need to be paid anything, and their desire was to save as many people as possible and how much money the agency could pay them. Soken looked at the hero with confusion, and Hui understood that with this money he could buy new equipment for the agency's hunters and build a new building for the Hunters Academy, and he wouldn't have to beg for donations from Mason. The hero, smiling broadly, said that he understood everything, to which the man replied that he didn't understand what exactly was understood, but everything was fine. The sun was shining through the half-open door, and words were heard that it was time to go eat. Everyone went outside, starting to prepare everything for rest. Soken, with his mouth wide open, asked Misan in bewilderment what this was. She, getting up from the lounger, asked them if they had finished eating, to which Soken exclaimed that this was the holy ground of the school. Misan, squinting her eyes in irritation, told him that they could now write a statement against him if he called this place a school, to which Soken, perplexed by what was happening, replied that a building would be built here next year. She said that staying in this place would be bad for Jin's skincare routine, to which the guy in front of her asked, smiling, what about him? She glanced at the boy and turned to him. Misan asked him who he was, and the guy was very upset, almost crying. While the two men were unloading the car, Misan turned to the man and asked if this was the last box, to which he nodded approvingly. She added that they should make sure that everything was properly organized. Hui, watching all this from near the building, couldn't understand where Misan got all this from. She nudged the hero with her shoulder and said with a small smile that she had installed the entire subspace. Misan turned her attention to the man who was putting the table in the box and said that this space was not yet fully commercialized, but since their company developed it anyway, they would be the first to use it. She told Hui that she could give him one if he needed it, to which he nodded approvingly. He remembered that he already had a similar invention in the form of a wallet with a locking function, but it would also be developed by Dasen in the future. Misan extended her hand to the protagonist, saying that they had never properly met, and said her name. She added that she was the master of the Dasen Guild and was currently helping the hunter Soken in many ways, while the hunter was showing the students how to make wreaths. The protagonist nodded approvingly and thought that the guild magnate was finally talking to him. In the distance, small buildings of the academy were visible. He added that he was looking forward to working with her. The teacher was drawing runes in a notebook and heard someone address him. Sonen, with his mouth wide open, asked the teacher if it was true that his main weapon was a sword, to which he shook his head. Squinting, he thought that they would most likely notice that he had similar moves to the agency director if he used a spear. The student, with wide eyes, asked if Hui could teach them, to which he replied that they had the best hunter in South Korea for the job. Raising a finger, Seonyoung added that the director used a spear. The student also said that the director advised them to borrow from the teacher since the hunter would sometimes be absent from school. The teacher frowned in confusion. Seonyoung, with an open mouth, said that he was going to tell the protagonist something. Sitting in front of the cabinet, he turned to the teacher and said that there were more teachers now and he did not need to be at the school all the time, to which Hui exclaimed that they needed to bring more staff. Putting his hand to his chin, the director said that they cannot invite anyone until they reveal the runes to the public. The hero, with narrowed eyes, said that the Dasen hunters are trustworthy. While packing up the things, the hunter said that Misan would not give them her hunters and that her people were still strangers, and it was better for the protagonist to take care of that. The teacher, with his mouth slightly open in thought, asked why the principal thought he was qualified, and he replied that he could see it in his eyes. The hunter, with a wide smile, said that the eyes were the window to the soul. Looking at the principal with fury, the teacher thought about how this man could become the strongest in the country, while the principal said that he would not allow the students to use mana, and that he should simply correct their posture. The principal, picking up the bag from the floor, said that the teacher could just fight them for training. They would definitely learn something if they were beaten. The principal looked at Hui and warned that the students would soon sneak up on him and take his head, to which the teacher shook his head in bewilderment. The teacher's pupils turned white while the director was telling him that he would give the students a gift if they hit him on the head. They stood silently opposite each other. The director was zipping up his bag when the teacher asked about Hyun. The hunter replied that he left her in the care of Mrs. Kim, since healers and magicians are similar. The director began to leave and said that he had to go, and the hero asked where he was going. The hunter, opening the door, said that he would look into the dungeon of the Songpa district. The teacher asked to take him with him. The director, turning to the hero, said that they did not know what the Ark could have done to him and that it was dangerous, and added that he should go there first and see if there was anything suspicious there. Putting his hand on the teacher's shoulder, he said that he would be back soon and asked him to take care of the children. The protagonist sighed deeply and asked to hurry. The next morning, near the small buildings of the academy, there was an equipped rest area with flowers and sun loungers. There was a small coffee van parked near another building. There were students standing in front of the teacher, who looked around and wondered when he had managed to park the van there. The teacher put his fist to his face and told the students to remember one thing. The students stood in a line while the teacher told them that the strongest would survive. Sonen laughed and exclaimed that the teacher didn't speak very coolly. Hui lowered his head a little and asked the students if they had been to the dungeon. The students' eyes widened and they looked at the teacher in confusion. Someone raised their hand and said that they had already been to the dungeon. The boy looked at the teacher when the teacher asked if his name was Hansen, to which the boy answered in the affirmative. The student lowered his head and the teacher asked him how it was. All the students turned to look at Hansen, who said that everything was completely different there. One of the universes appeared and the teacher said that there was a theory that the dungeons were in other dimensions. Hui remembered Minseo's speech at the conference and tried to remember what she said. The teacher remembered the monsters that were in the dungeon and said that there were no people there and in order to survive, you need to stop being human. The teacher, frowning a little, told the students not to attach much importance to the fact that they are people and added that in the dungeons they should act relying only on their instincts. He stood in front of the students, holding a sword in his hands, and asked if the principal took a break from real battles, to which the students responded approvingly. The teacher gripped the sword tighter in his hands. He said that he will teach them the same way as the principal, but he is not as good. He swung his sword and started talking about how he was going to awaken the students' instincts and added that he would not kill them and asked them to try their best. A group of hunters led by Sionen and Misan appeared in the Bangi-dong area of Seoul for a D-rank dungeon. The headmaster of the academy asked if this gate was really a D-rank gate, to which Misan answered positively. The hunter standing next to Misan held a tablet in his hands. He said that there would be a re-evaluation of the dungeon soon, to which she, with her mouth slightly open, said that it should have been done a long time ago. The buildings of this area were visible. Hunter Sionen said that it was very inconvenient to work with foreign hunters since they did not trust the Korean dungeon evaluation system and added that many of the dungeons were re-evaluated. The hunter narrowed his eyes and asked Misan about her. The huntress turned away arrogantly and said that she didn't need to scam to make money, to which he replied that he probably underestimated her. The hunters handed the recorder to Misan and took the tablet from the director. She also added that he should apologize. The hunter did as she asked. The huntress brought the recorder to her face. Standing in front of the open gate to the dungeon, she said that today is May 24, 2024, and that they are at a D-rank dungeon in Seoul, Songpa district. She also added that 5 people are entering, saying that it is 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There was green grass in the dungeon. The hunters looked around, seeing only a blue, slightly cloudy sky. They looked around confusedly. Misan asked Soken to say something, to which he replied that he was very ashamed. The hunters began to enter the dense forest, saying that this was probably a D-rank dungeon, because even at C-rank they didn't let you relax like that. The hunters were already standing in the forest. The director of the academy asked the hunter next to him if there was any information about any monsters. He responded approvingly. He opened his eyes wider and added that the monsters here were like insects and they lived in this forest. The hunters went deeper into the forest and stuck together. The S-rank hunter asked what the monsters here ate. The hunter next to him said that they were most likely herbivores. Soken said that this was rare. Insects similar to centipedes were crawling on the ground, and one of the hunters added that they saw these monsters eating leaves and showing no interest in the meat and blood they brought. He also added that they were also curious about people, but never attacked them. The hunters looked at the ground where these insects were crawling. One of the hunters said that their body fluids were harmless. Another hunter said that the core was in the middle of the forest and no monsters were guarding it. Soken suspiciously asked if they had checked everything thoroughly. The hunter frowned and thought about how this was a D-rank dungeon and that there were peaceful and calm monsters here. While watching them closely, Soken thrust his spear into one of the monsters. He couldn't understand why the Ark paid attention to this dungeon. Misan screamed in fear because of such a sharp attack from the hunter. The huntress stood nearby and couldn't catch her breath. The S-rank hunter asked about her dislike for bugs, to which she replied that she doesn't like anything that has more legs than her. Soken raised his spear in front of the huntress's face, on the end of which was one of these monsters. She screamed in fear. He stood and laughed, while the huntress screamed for him to get the monster away from him, until she took out her weapon. Insects were still crawling under the hunter's feet. Soken raised his hand to stop the hunters. He bit his lip, feeling something. The hunter lowered his head, visibly wary, and said that something was near them. Behind him stood the hunters with Misan. She could not say a word from fear. They began to walk towards the bloody tracks, where a pile of rotting corpses lay. The S-rank hunter said that it was not for nothing that they did not react to ordinary meat, because these creatures like rot. The protagonist rested his face in his hand and asked the dungeon of the Sampa district why she was doing this. How many times he told her that first she needed to write a report. The girl in front of him answered that she had been there once, to which Hui asked discontentedly if she had really opened her third eye there. Jiyeon looked at the protagonist and firmly answered that she was not joking, adding that she needed to clean it up. Hui abruptly stood up from his chair and threateningly said that he was not joking either. He began to push her out of the office, ordering the girl to get out because he needed to work. While the guy was trying to close the door, Jiyeon talked about the raid. After a loud scream, the protagonist abruptly woke up. He slowly sat up on the bed, asking himself what kind of hellish dream this was. Hui clutched the blanket and asked why she didn't do it secretly from others. He introduced Jiyeon and asked why the person who never listened to him was standing next to him and waiting for permission. Leaving the memories, he put his hand to his head and said that he needed to go to work. At work, the protagonist turned around when asked if he could tell the principal to hurry up, to which he immediately replied that he did not have his number, so he did not know what the principal had been doing for the past 4 days. Not far from him on the ground were beaten students, looking at whom Hui menacingly asked if they had already rested and wanted to start again since they had the strength to speak. The guy raised his hand with the last of his strength and apologized for everyone. The girl lying next to him said that, blinded by the prize, she aimed at the teacher's head, to which the protagonist said that he doubted that they behaved the same way with the principal. The student turned her head with tears in her eyes and said that the principal did not pressure them that much. Suddenly, a girl approached them with a container and asked if they wanted water. Taking the water, the students happily said that it was wonderful. The girl held a bottle of water and said that she was a real healer because she really saved them, to which the healer replied that she felt awkward resting alone, only because she was a healer. Suddenly, she saw a car approaching them from the side. Legs appeared from the open door of the car and an angry scream was heard that she came here only because she was a student, otherwise she would not have done this. Suddenly, the healer was shocked by who she saw. The girl waved her hand and shouted, greeting her sister and adding that she came because she wanted to see her. The protagonist and his colleague looked at the girls talking to each other in surprise. The healer pulled the girl's cheek and said that she was her younger sister. Pointing to the teacher, she told her sister to greet him properly, to which she immediately bowed and said that she was pleased to meet him. Hui looked at the girl without any emotion as she said that she heard that he saved her sister's life, so she was very grateful to him. The healer's sister smiled widely and exclaimed that her name was Jiyeon. The guy greeted her with a confused smile and said to himself that he had a bad feeling about this, and then wondered if this was really Jiyeon, who respected him, who smiled with sparkles in her eyes. After thinking about this, he, without taking his eyes off the girl, asked if she really came here to see her sister, to which she happily exclaimed, yes, although she wondered if the teacher could go with them to the district office. Looking at the teacher, she explained that she was told that they needed a sponsor who was C rank or higher. Hearing this, the protagonist asked in surprise, a hunter. Jiyeon raised her fist and shouted happily, yes, because she had awakened. Hearing this, her sister threw her arms out and screamed, asking when this happened, to which her sister put her hands on her hips and replied that she had torn a soccer ball in gym class today. Having calmed down, the healer asked in confusion if that was why the teachers had let her go, to which Sheen, turning to her sister, replied yes, adding that she had been told to talk to her sister and go register. Looking over her sister's shoulder, she asked how she had felt when she woke up. The protagonist looked at Hyunwook and wondered if the girl thought the guy was fat, and Hyunwook replied that it was nothing special to him. The protagonist wondered in his head if Hyun's death in Myeongdong was the catalyst afterwards, while Hansung asked Jiyeon to go and register with the teacher. He added that if the girl didn't do it in a week, she would be fined, which left Jiyeon's sister very shocked. She frowned and said that she registered much later after waking up, but she had never heard of it when the girl suddenly asked if she hadn't gone to the principal. She said that the principal would take care of it, since she had been helped once too, and then turned around and asked Hansung if the school principal had dealt with his situation. The guy nodded and replied that he had been helped to sue the guild and get compensation. The protagonist turned to Miss Kim and ordered him to go with the student to register. The teacher put her hand to her chest and shouted in confusion that she was an S rank, after which Hui asked in surprise if she was bragging. The girl responded menacingly that there might be problems if her name was listed as a guarantor, since the press loves to hear about such things, when she suddenly asked why the guy didn't go. The protagonist immediately told her that he couldn't. Looking into the distance, he added that he didn't have a phone when Kim suddenly fell silent in surprise. The teacher put her hands on the girl's shoulders, saying that the student chose Hui to go with her, to which Jiyeon agreed, saying that she had thought of something. She clenched her hands into fists and asked if the protagonist could take her as a student. The guy's face sweated with embarrassment, and he asked if she was even talking to him. Ji-yeon's eyes were shining brightly as she shouted for the guy to take her as his disciple, after which Hui decided to think about it calmly. The guy knew that Ji-yeon was a guaranteed genius and she was loyal, so there were many ways to use her if she went to him, which meant that the instinctive discomfort was his personal issue that needed to be worked on. After much thought, Hui answered no when suddenly the student's expression changed. The protagonist said that he was not a mage or anything like that, so there was no point in taking disciples, and asked the girl to come when she graduated from high school, while Kim watched their argument. Ji-yeon lowered her head, saying that she read on the internet that the golden time was a month after awakening. She sheepishly said that in the first 3 days, you need to remove the evil spirits from the body with magic, to which Kim shook her head, saying that she had never heard of it. The student was surprised, adding that she had seen something like that before. She handed the mana effect sheet to the protagonist, saying that she had gotten it while waiting for the teacher in the morning. Hui began to examine it, while the girl added that she had kept the sheet because there were no trash cans. The boy suddenly looked at Ji-yeon. He was embarrassed, saying that it was stupid, so he asked her not to worry and wait for the principal. The protagonist clapped his hands, asking if they had a good rest, and then asked Ji-yeon to look after her sister. The student looked down menacingly, saying that she would not want to come here after seeing what kind of classes they had, to which Hui said with a smile that he thought it was really fun. The boy, with tears in his eyes, shouted that the teacher was of course having fun. The protagonist told the students that they were still weak, when suddenly a loud childish scream was heard. That night at the cafe, Seok-ken asked if Ji-yeon had woken up in the morning. The protagonist asked if the director knew her, to which he thoughtfully replied that he helped them because he felt sorry for 2 children living on their own. Kim, with a smile on her face, replied that the girl was very brave and asked Hwie to take her as his student. She added with a laugh that Ji-yeon did not give up even after seeing the protagonist teaching children, and she had never seen him so excited, to which Seok-ken smiled and said that he should have come faster so as not to miss this sight. The guy exhaled heavily, asking her to stop teasing him and take a look at something, when suddenly the director interrupted him, saying that he had something to say. He held out a photo of the guy, saying that it was a corpse found in the dungeon of the Songpa district, asking if the guy recognized him. Hwie began to carefully examine the photo, saying that he did not recognize it. Soken started to explain that it was Kim who sacrificed himself to give the boy a chance to escape from the ark, wondering if the protagonist really didn't recognize him. The director's face changed, asking with shining eyes who Hui was. There was a noise coming from the establishment. A dish was placed on the boys' table and they were told that it was the chicken they ordered. When the waiter left, Soken asked if the protagonist had anything to say. Hui stared at the man and said that it was time to stop this. What? The director asked displeasedly, folding his arms over his chest and adding that he was just getting started. The protagonist suddenly smiled and asked if Kim was a girl, after which he added that he shouldn't be confused with some unknown guy, at the same time saying in his head that he was not so stupid as to take the identity of some random guy and leave everything to luck, hoping that everything would work out. Some time ago, while at home, Hui opened the system screen and asked, Kim, right? In the search bar, he added the parameters of missing or dead, and also used Kim as the last name, choosing those who seemed to be related to her. Without taking his eyes off the screen, he thought to himself that since Mr. was such an old man, he just called them by their last name and didn't really care about their gender. Several people appeared in front of him, one of whom was leaving and another who died while trying to stop the dungeon breakout in Gyeongsang-do. The last person was Yuwa, who went missing. Looking at her, the protagonist said that she was a police officer before waking up, and the report said that Mr. worked with her on many cases. Without a hint of emotion on his face, he said to himself that the records disappeared due to undercover work, and in the end, they did not return. Currently, Hui looked at the man and asked who the guy was and if he killed someone to test him. Soken smiled and answered, no way. He then pointed at the tablet and explained that he found it in the dungeon of the Songpa district. They said that the dungeon has guards 24/7 but they are not sure how he got there, so he wanted to ask if the protagonist knows about this rune. Hearing this, the protagonist put his hand on the table and asked displeasedly if he really needed help, so he probed it with Kim. Suddenly, a girl next to them slammed her hand on the table and yelled that she did not understand anything they were saying from the beginning, then asked who Kim was and why the gender of this person does not matter. The guys looked at the girl in surprise and asked if she was drunk, to which she yelled for them not to change the topic. The protagonist smirked and asked if the girl knew that he was from the Ark, to which she replied of course. She spread her hand and said that he never said it outright, but she would be stupid not to find out after what he did at the training center. She looked at Hwijan, who raised his hand to his face and wondered if he had brought her here without explaining anything. After a while, the protagonist calmly said, "So that's what happened?" To which the girl said, "Yeah, so that's why." She then pointed her finger at Soken and asked if he suspected him anymore. Lowering his hand, the man replied, "Then, although it's not much, it's an apology." He took out some cards and happily said that these were the protagonists. Soken handed them to Hwijin and explained that they were identification cards, adding that the details were filled in based on his words in the investigator's office. It didn't matter that it was a lie, he should just live with it. The protagonist took the gift, and Soken added that it was a hunter's license, which was currently a D class, but he could renew it later. After that, he spread his arms and said finally, this is his bank book and check card, adding that he noticed that his salary day had already passed. Then the guy asked if the amount was correct. Hui sat motionless while Soken spoke. Of course he made sure he calculated it correctly. After all, he is not one of those black executives, so he even thought about his insurance, adding that he should have taken the money he spent for the month, but the protagonist should consider that he is the one paying for it. After that, he took Hui's card and said that he knew that he was touched, but he can look at it later, now it's time to eat. Hearing this, the protagonist was very surprised and wondered if his face really looked like someone who was moved by his actions. While Miss Kim and Seok Ken were rejoicing, Hui was saying to himself that he wouldn't even let him raid the dungeon, so what was the point of the insurance? Adding that if you subtract everything that was needed, it was no different from the allowance he received when he was young. With these thoughts, he put his hand to his face and said in his head that putting aside the money issue, the important thing was that Seok Ken gave him these things. He looked at the food thoughtfully, thinking that the director had finally stopped bothering him and accepted that he was one of the poor children from the ark. The protagonist handed over the paper after telling him about the rumors that were going around about Hyun. Soken grabbed his head, confusedly asking what kind of nonsense was written so elegantly on the paper, while Hui explained that this was the Ark research facility. The director and Kim were surprised, while the guy added that this was a branch that the Ark made to secretly recruit new members. Soken wondered why they were acting like some kind of third-rate cult, to which Hui replied that they did it to gather a lot of people to choose from later. The guy looked at them, adding that they were probably looking for good test subjects, since one of the Ark's goals was to create an artificial awakening method. When Soken suddenly asked in shock what one of the Ark's goals was, frowning, he did not understand what an artificial awakening method was. Taking a sip of beer, the guy replied that the people from the Ark kidnapped children to increase the number of test subjects. He asked what they thought the Ark was like when the director suddenly suggested a global crime syndicate in confusion. Soken looked down in frustration. He began to remember how 2 years ago, an acquaintance of his was sent to the United States, but the team he was part of was wiped out, and in order to at least get his corpse back, the director followed the trail, and eventually first learned about the Ark on the black market in South America. But when he looked into it further, he finally realized that it was not some small organization, and the cases of dungeon massacres, illegal awakeners, drugs and the like, they were involved in all kinds of crimes. He folded his hands together, adding that all the countries they were in were conducting private investigations. Hui turned his head to the side, thinking that he was starting to understand that the Ark was just a part of the organization, and they had a part that dealt with funds and research, so even if they were investigating common criminals, they would never know anything about the experiments from them. Kim drew a rune on the tablet, asking if Hui could tell what it meant. The protagonist confidently answered that it was a rune that he had never seen. Soken wondered if there were runes that even a guy didn't know about, to which the protagonist spread his arms out, asking how he could remember all the runes that he couldn't even use. He suddenly turned to the girl. With a smile, Hui said that he could easily figure out what that rune was. The next day, Kim opened the trunk, shouting that it was time for lunch. The students began to scream, happy about the food. They ran to the car with crazy eyes, while the teacher asked what was wrong with the children. The protagonist asked if she brought what he asked for, to which Kim held out her hand with the bag forward, shouting of course. Hui walked up to the table, praising her. The guy handed the notebook to her, saying that the girl could draw a rune like that and stick it on. Kim asked if it was the same rune that was in the picture, but it seemed like there were several, to which Hui replied that he didn't know why they were in such a hurry, but they were so sloppy, so he had to draw several versions. The girl asked if he did it by accident, to which the protagonist asked her to stop talking nonsense and drawing. At this time, the students were having lunch, talking among themselves. Jinwoo took a sip of water when he suddenly noticed something off to the side. Kim said that she thought it would be more grandiose since they were doing tests, but everything was simpler, when suddenly a student asked with a smile what they were planning. He opened his mouth wide when he saw the rune they hadn't learned, asking why they were putting it on meat, to which Hui replied that they needed to check something. Jinwoo asked if they were working on a new rune, since that would explain why they were so similar. The protagonist said menacingly that Kim hadn't eaten yet, so he should go play somewhere else. The teacher asked if the sandwich was good, to which Jinwoo yelled yes, since the meals the principal brought usually only had meat, so he was starting to miss vegetables. He suddenly asked if the principal was back. The girl scratched her head in confusion, saying that he was late. The student suddenly turned to Kim. He asked if she smelled a strange smell coming from somewhere. HWE turned around, thinking that those bastards from the Ark really were using runes to fill the dungeons with rotten meat. Before the regression, when HWE was a teenager, the protagonist came to Mr. Soken's room and spoke to him. Soken was lying on the couch while the guy asked him if he had thought about getting a hunter's license. Soken rested his head on his hand and said in surprise that he had thought about not wanting to be a hunter. He suddenly jumped up and shouted, asking if he had been told something at school or if someone was bullying him, so he was going to the school office right now. Hearing this, the protagonist asked him in surprise what he was talking about. He picked up the remote control and said that there was simply too much competition for the civil service exam. Hearing this, Soken smiled and said that he could make room for him, to which the guy replied that it seemed like someone wanted to drag him to another hearing. He sat down next to him and said that he asked because he was wondering if he could get extra points for getting a hunter's license. Soken scratched his cheek and said that he wasn't sure. HWE adjusted his jacket and asked if the man wasn't the most influential person in the management agency, to which he replied that he was, but he wasn't in charge of recruiting. He then smiled and added that he would look for information, so he first needed to get a license, and since he was going to do it, he should also get as high a rank as possible, to which HWE said that it sounded tempting since he was thinking of getting a D rank. Hearing this, Soken opened his mouth wide and shouted that he was his son and therefore couldn't get a D rank, to which the protagonist said that maybe he didn't inherit his skills because he was an adopted son. The man let out a heavy sigh. He patted the guy's head and said that it seemed like he couldn't beat him. Currently, Soken, with a bag over his shoulder, said that there was a person in the dungeon. The protagonist stood not far away in front of him and asked if it was a human, to which he replied that although he was found dead, there was indeed a human in the dungeon. He also said that Dasen said that they would investigate it, so they would have to wait for now. The more they pursued them, the more he doubted what they were. Hearing this, the protagonist was speechless. Soken took out a piece of paper from his bag and suggested that they focus on preparing for the field training in the dungeon, to which HWE asked in surprise if he was already going to training, then said that with his skills, even B rank would be considered a backup option, then asked where he got them from. Soken looked at the guy and asked what he wanted to say. Handing the papers to him, he added that he was going with him, to which the guy asked in surprise what. Soken turned away and asked what was the matter, adding that he thought HWE was capable enough. The protagonist took the papers and said that if he was going to work so hard, he should give him a raise. He knew he had a lot of money. Soken closed his eyes and said that it was quite expensive to run a school, to which the guy said that it wasn't even that they had a lot of students. The principal then pointed out and said that they also had to build a building. When the protagonist asked, Soken was confused and, without moving from his seat, replied that because there were a lot of dungeons here, construction companies avoided this place unless they were offered a high salary for the danger. Hearing this, the protagonist suggested clearing out the dungeons. The principal pointed at the papers and said that's what it was for. Without taking his eyes off the man, the guy asked if it wouldn't be faster for him to clear them out, to which the man smiled and said no. He placed his hand on the table and said that in conclusion, they needed the results of the work. He presented 3 containers and said that this was a model school that he had built using his name. Many disagreed, saying that hunters did not need a school, but they gave in because he was the one pushing the idea. Picking up the teapot, Soken added that this is why he needs results, adding that if it were Miss Kim or him, people would not consider it a worthy result. Pouring boiling water into a mug, he said that the number of awakened is increasing every year, but the losses in the dungeons are also increasing at the same rate. Pouring out the coffee, the headmaster added that the hunters are becoming more and more unsociable and their skills are stagnating, so the situation is inevitably getting worse, so this school cannot fail if they want to protect the new awakened. After saying this, he drank the drink he received. He then looked at the protagonist, who was beaming with joy, and said that there was actually an easier way to do this, to which the protagonist asked which one. Soken picked up a stick and said that they could announce that they would only teach the runes they were about to talk about at their school. Hearing this, HWE firmly said that he would try his best. After a while, the students asked in shock if they were talking about a real dungeon. The principal stood next to the protagonist and said that it had been 3 months since their school opened, so it was time for the test, so HWE would go into the dungeon with him. The protagonist took a marker in his hand and explained that the day of practical training was on June 15th. They would enter the C-rank dungeon near the school, and he would accompany them for evaluation, so he would only interfere at critical moments. The protagonist said that from now on, the students should form groups to clear the dungeon, so they must first understand 4 things. The guy pointed to the board, saying that only after they had understood these 4 things, they could begin to strategize and form a team. He explained that the natural environment they would be entering was similar to Earth, but due to the distortion of dimensions, there were also strange and unusual occurrences. While the students took notes, MANHWA asked them to recall the incidents they had seen in the media or experienced, while Seo uncovered her face with her hand in confusion. Memories of her younger self immediately came to mind. Her grandfather smiled as he called out to her. He said that she would become a mage who would surpass her because he believed in her. Looking down at her notebook, she heard voices in her head. MANHWA pointed to the board, saying that this would be enough for a rough explanation, so they could go have lunch and then conduct individual interviews. The guy pointed his finger forward, asking them to think about what the students were missing in the pixie's face because it would upset their stomachs. The students quickly began to leave the classroom. The protagonist noticed a girl sitting at a desk. He asked if the student wasn't going to lunch. Drops of tears fell on the girl's notebook. MANHWA became scared, asking what happened and whether his lecture was too difficult. Seo uncovered her face with a trembling hand, calling for the teacher. With tears in her eyes, she said that she wanted to leave the school. The protagonist's mouth fell open in surprise. The student insisted that she had no talent and was not fit to become a mage, so before she became a burden, she should leave while she still could. The guy grabbed his head, asking if someone had told her something, to which the girl screamed in fear, "Not at all." Seo added that she could not use magic normally, to which MANHWA asked in bewilderment, did not she know that her spell speed was higher than most agents on duty? The student turned around in confusion. The guy asked if she really thought that Jinwoo could not use magic either, to which she screamed loudly, asking what he had to do with it. Seo said that he had awakened only 6 months ago, and she more than 10 years ago. With a trembling voice, she added that she knew unique magic, and it wasn't even that she didn't know the formula, because she understood it all. Seo screamed, angrily asking how she could call herself a mage if she couldn't even use the formula she understood, because she had to become an archmage. The girl placed her trembling fists on her knees. After a short pause, the protagonist asked where she learned unique magic. The girl began to explain that it was before her grandfather died, and MANHWA asked if he could find out what attribute it had. The student thought about it, answering that it was light, and her grandfather usually used channeling magic. The guy suddenly smiled widely. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder, saying that she had many talents. Soeon's face changed, hearing that the protagonist would make her an archmage. Arriving at the principal's office, the protagonist said that Soken was going to drop out of school. Hearing this, Soken jumped up and shouted, asking what. Turning to the guy, he asked for the reason, to which MANHWA put his hand on the table and said that he was talking to her. After a short pause, he added that she thought she had no talent, to which the director smiled and laughed. He broke the chopsticks and said that she simply had too high standards, since her grandfather was too great a man, then added that he did not know anyone more strict than him, since he always finished things to the end, so the speed of completing the raid was good, but it was not very good for the mind. The protagonist turned to the man in surprise and asked if he really knew him personally. Soken put food in his mouth and replied that he knew his son, Soyeon's father. He remembered him and said that the last time he saw him was after his son's death, when he disbanded the guild to take care of his granddaughter. After that, he only heard about him at the funeral. While chewing his food, he continued to say that he had been very strict with his son, but it seemed that he had become softer with Soeon. Soken remembered the man again and said that a father who, like him, wanted his son to succeed, and an ordinary son who had not inherited any of his father's talents. Remembering how the man held a portrait of his son in his hands, he added that a father who wanted to pass on the Lantern Guild and his unique magic to his son, who ended up dying during an overzealous raid into a dungeon. Imagining a house in a dense forest, the director added that after his son's death, Nojin regretted being a father and raised his granddaughter in the quiet of his hometown and died a hero, helping civilians evacuate during a dungeon breach. Leaving the memories, he looked forward and said that after that, another guardian took care of her until she came here. After listening to the director, MANHWA asked when Mr. Park died, to which Soken looked up and replied that he thought it was around the time Seoeon turned 10. Hearing this, the protagonist asked him who the guardian was. The food was getting scarce, and the director replied that he heard that it was the lawyer of Mr. Park's guild. Apparently he was preparing for something like this to happen, since they had no relatives. MANHWA looked at the interlocutor and asked if Seoeon only learned her magic from her grandfather, to which the director lowered his head and replied yes. He then looked at the guy and asked if something was bothering him, to which the protagonist turned away and said that he had a feeling that he was no less strict with her. Putting the spoon in his mouth, he said to himself that it was common among magicians to force a child to follow the path the parent wants even after losing the child, adding that he was not sure, but he should not refer to her trauma. After thinking this, he looked at the man and told him to take care of her no matter what, to which the director chuckled. Hearing this, Hui puffed out his cheeks and asked him with displeasure what kind of reaction this was. Soken put his hand on the boy's shoulder and replied that he felt that he would take care of her even if he did not. As he left, he asked him with a smile on his face if he understood. Without stopping, he said one last thing that he expected from a magic tutor. Hearing this, the protagonist turned around abruptly and asked, "Domestic? Since when?" The director turned around and replied that everyone already considered him one. Hui stepped towards him, telling him to raise his salary if he didn't want him to be a home tutor, to which Soken said confusedly that lunch was already over, so he had to give the kids a lecture. "Salary?" the protagonist said menacingly, coming even closer, to which the principal simply wished him luck. The boy looked in shock at the man, who walked away whistling. Throwing the trash in the trash, he said that then. Turning around, the protagonist finished saying that he would go talk to the kids in his class. When the principal heard Hui say that he was sure that he would take care of the rest of the kids who weren't mages, he was shocked, imagining all the kids. Falling to his knees, he shouted after the protagonist that he couldn't do this to him. In the classroom, Hui stood in front of the two kids, asking if they had thought about it. He put his hands on his hips and asked the guy if he thought he could survive the dungeon, to which the guy asked in response if they should really be more worried about their survival than the raid itself. The protagonist added that he didn't expect the boys to come up with a great answer in an hour, so they could skip this topic anyway, which shocked Jinwoo. He asked why the teacher told them to think, then folded his hands on his stomach, adding that he had indigestion from thinking like that, to which the protagonist replied so that they would understand how useless they were. He added that if the boy was seriously thinking, then it was good, since everyone was useless at first. Hui looked at the students, saying that a hunter should know how to find their weaknesses and make up for them. Jinwoo thought about his own, asking where they would start, since he had lost the point. The teacher picked up a pen, smiling, asking if the boys knew what element of magic they belonged to. The boy thought that there was nothing more subject to change than a mage's value in this society, so now they were the most valuable, but once the runes that hide mana and the mana pen were developed, their value would drop. Taking the plate in his hands, he thought about how the mages adapted. The protagonist knew that they were isolated, so they doubled up. Countless magical research societies had disappeared, and they all started trying all sorts of weird things to try and pass on their magical element to their descendants. Hui poured the substance into the plate, thinking that an archmage from France, who could no longer bear to see innocent children suffer, had learned how mana worked and revealed to the public how to find their element. And the mages learned from him, and also analyzed the mana of their children, keeping those who had the same element as them and discarding those who did not, so they were sent to the Hunter Academy. The teacher leaned his elbows on the table, telling the children that they would use these items to test their elements. Kim raised her palm, saying that she did not want to interrupt him, then wondered if the only way to know your element was not to feel it yourself. The protagonist put his hand to his chin, thinking about how to explain it. After some thought, the boy answered that it was a method developed by the same mage who created the runes. The teacher's eyes sparkled and she offered to try. Hui began to speak. In order to determine the element of an awakened mage, you need to do the following. Mix the golden powder of the dwarves, which can strengthen mana, with clean water, and then soak the feather of the swan guarding the spring of Erda in this mixture. The girl raised the feather up, because at the end it needed to be filled with mana. The feather suddenly began to glow brightly. The roots of the rose immediately began to burst out. Hui looked at the shocked students and said that it was not difficult. Kim came to her senses and screamed loudly, asking who this mage was and if he understood how amazing it was, while the boy asked which of the children wanted to go first. The teacher's face changed, ordering the protagonist not to play dumb, begging him to tell her who this mage was. An evil aura emanated from her body from ignoring her question. Hui coldly replied that he was dead. He exhaled and held out the pen towards Seoan, asking her to try it while Kim remained silent in confusion. The pen in the student's hands began to glow dimly. After a few seconds, she said in frustration that nothing was happening while the teacher asked her to continue putting in her mana. At that same second, the pen changed its color, turning black. Seoan asked in fear what it was, to which the protagonist replied that he knew it was an elemental problem. The guy explained that her element was shadow, the opposite of light, and it wasn't that she wasn't good enough for her grandfather, it was just that her element didn't match his. An awkward silence hung between them, after which Hui asked Jinwoo to try it too. After a few seconds, the pen lit up, meaning that the student had succeeded. The protagonist's expression changed abruptly, loudly ordering him to let go of the pen right now, because it was real fire. Jinwoo was surprised that it was fire, but it was not hot at all. The guy asked curiously what it was and what type it was. Hui looked up at him, answering that the guy had the element of light. The protagonist met with Seoyeon after class, who said that she had thought about something. She looked at the teacher and said that she really couldn't use her grandfather's magic. Slightly lowering her gaze, she added that unlike Jinwoo, Everything had fallen into place now, so she decided to look at this situation from a different angle. Hearing this, the protagonist said that he saw that she had thought about it a lot, to which the girl smiled and said that it was true. She kept her hands on her skirt and said that she was still sorry that she couldn't use her grandfather's magic, but she didn't want this knowledge to sink into oblivion. Without moving from her place, she added that Mrs. Yemin talked about many spells being lost in this way. It was so stupid, to which the guy asked what she wanted. Seoan suddenly put her hand to her chest and said that she wanted to teach Jinwoo. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise and said to himself, "This is what is usually meant by wiping your nose without using your hands," after which he asked himself if she really came to him with such a proposal. After these thoughts, without taking his eyes off Seoan, he asked if she was really ready to pass on all the knowledge of her grandfather's spells, to which she firmly answered yes, adding that she did not want his knowledge and experience to go to waste, but she did not want to teach it to just anyone either. After listening to her, the guy asked if she was really sure that she wanted to teach someone she had not known for long, to which Seoan nodded and answered 100%. Listening to Hui say that she might feel that way now, but she might change her mind once she sees him use magic, she shifted from foot to foot. She then lowered her head slightly and said that she thought the teacher was right, she would have to watch and judge anyway. The protagonist looked at the confused girl and said that she wasn't as mentally exhausted as he thought. Apparently it was one of the advantages of being young, or her psyche had strengthened during this time. Putting his hand to his chin, he added that either he was just a genius teacher. Without taking his eyes off Seoan, Hui thought about how her mood changed with the wind, and then wondered how the old man could handle her, but maybe it would work in his favor. After a while, Jinwoo answered with a confused expression, no. Hearing this, Miss Kim and Hui asked in shock what, to which the guy replied that he had nothing against Seoan. He looked at the teachers and calmly said that becoming her student was too much. Hearing this, Kim slammed her hands on the table and screamed, asking why the hell he was breaking down. She looked at the student with a face white with shock and said that he seemed to not fully understand the whole situation, to which he replied that he was also a mage and was well aware that this was a good opportunity for him. Looking down, she added that he really did not want to. The protagonist did not take his eyes off the guy, asking why, what was the reason. Jinwoo scratched the back of his head in confusion and replied that he could not treat a friend as a teacher. The teachers were speechless from what they heard. Closing his eyes, Hui asked himself if his reason was really that stupid. Was this really why he was giving up the chance to become an archmage? The guy looked down and said that he understood that such an opportunity only came once in a lifetime. Without raising his head, he added that he also knew how much this magic meant to Seoan. Then the protagonist said in his head that most mages awaken at an early age, some even when they first stand on their own, but Jinwoo awakened too late. The boy looked at the floor and said that he didn't think he was smart enough to learn this new magic. He twiddled his fingers and added that he didn't want to see Seoan disappointed in him or blame herself, but he also didn't want to exhaust himself just to keep up with her. The protagonist looked at Jinwoo, who said that he didn't want to make things awkward between them, and said to himself that it was rare for mages who spent their childhoods away from everyone to have developed emotional intelligence, and then asked himself where the old man found this boy. The student raised his head and said, confused, that he had no ambitions to become an archmage or master unique magic because he was quite happy being an ordinary mage. The protagonist exhaled, saying that the student could go and rest. Kim ran after him, perplexed, asking if the guy was really giving up like that. She was indignant that the teacher should understand the full value of Jinwoo's unique magic. Hui turned to her, asking if the student was really as talentless as he thought, to which the girl replied, confused, that she could not say. She thought that talent in magic is a multifaceted thing, and it is difficult to explain to someone who is not a mage. Kim raised her index finger, saying that basic magic can only be mastered after spending a certain amount of time and effort, but that won't work with unique magic. She knew that someone who already uses basic magic might suddenly have an epiphany and become an archmage by mastering unique magic, while someone might excel at advanced magic but will never master unique magic. She closed her eyes, adding that it all depends on luck, when Hui suddenly asked in surprise, what about Jinwoo? Kim spread her arms out, saying that they won't know until they try. She said that the student was putting up barriers and limitations within himself, but she understood him, because the thought of mastering the magical legacy left by a friend's late grandfather. Shaking her head, the girl continued, it becomes a huge burden. The teacher wondered if Seoan had chosen Jinwoo herself. Hui exhaled heavily, thinking that he himself didn't know what to do when he was a teenager, so he didn't know what to advise Jinwoo. Hui remembered how Seokan placed his hands on his hands in his past life. He said with a smile that he would support the boy no matter what. He said that if his son wanted to go to college and work in a company, or, on the contrary, wanted to become a world-famous hunter, he would support him no matter what the boy chose. Soken said that if someone bullied the boy, it would be better to leave it to him, since he had enough strength to deal with even 2 people without anyone noticing, to which the protagonist refused. Soken smirked, asking if his son really hated him. He squeezed the protagonist's wrist, saying that he was also a human and he also had feelings. With a crazy look, he pointed to his cheek, saying that if the boy wanted, he could hit him right now. HWE pulled his hand away, shouting loudly, "Enough." The man clenched his fist, asking if the boy loved him again, to which the protagonist sternly replied that he hated him, wondering why the old man would even think that shock therapy could be used on a child. The teacher closed his eyes, thinking that he was the one who pushed the boundaries just to see if he could get away with it, so he had nothing to complain about. The boy took a step outside, thinking that it didn't seem like he could pull off the same trick. He walked forward, thinking that it was possible to resist the children's nature when Seoan suddenly called out to him. HWE said that Jinwoo didn't want to be her student. The girl's expression changed, looking at him in surprise. The protagonist explained that it wasn't that he didn't like the girl, because the student thought that he wasn't worthy of being her student. The boy added that Jinwoo also thought that he wasn't talented enough to be her student, and couldn't relate to her as a teacher. Seoan was surprised, asking if the teacher didn't try to convince the boy, to which HWE replied that he couldn't pressure him. The student began to stutter, saying that he pressured her. The protagonist coughed into his fist, answering that the girl was his student. Looking up at her, he added that Jinwoo was her student. The teacher said that Seoan would have her first task as a teacher, which was to be honest with Jinwoo and convince him otherwise. The girl quickly pulled the notebook sheet, tearing it out. She confidently directed the ball of paper into her mouth. The girl began to chew on it, which shocked the teachers, their faces changing. With a smile on her face, Seoan shouted that she would do so, when suddenly a thought flashed through HWE's mind that he would never understand these magicians. Before the protagonist's regression, Soken entered his room and said that they needed to talk, to which he replied that they had nothing to talk about because he was not his son. Hearing this, the man stopped in shock. Suddenly, he shouted the protagonist's name loudly, causing him to turn around in surprise. The boy looked at his father in surprise, who looked back at him in the same way. Suddenly, Soken put his hand on his knee. He knelt down and told the protagonist that he was his son. The boy looked at the table in disappointment and asked if this was really because of adoption, adding that the man should not worry because he would grow older and leave on his own. Without moving, he said that there was no need to call him by name because he did not want to hear it from Soken's lips. Without raising his head, he added that he was different from his son, so there was no need to be mistaken. Looking at his father, he added that he was like a stray dog that he picked up on the street. Looking at his son, Soken said that he did not know what he heard, but without finishing, the protagonist said that he learned from the friends of the great hunter Soken. He pictured the birds in the nest and said that he understood why a parent would not want their child to be some kind of orphan. Hearing this, Soken, kneeling down, said that he was not a replacement, to which Kim asked if this was true, and what then? A good story for the media, how a great hunter adopted a poor little orphan, setting an example for others. Soken thoughtfully put his hand to his chin. The man extended his hand forward, his voice shaking, saying that he ran away from the orphanage at the age of 19 and then woke up. He remembered how that day he saw a boy in whom he saw himself. With a grin, he added that he did not want HWE to experience the same thing as he did. Soken gently hugged his son, saying that this was why he decided to become his father. Kim was confused, because until now she could not understand HWE's teaching method. She didn't understand if it was okay to push everything onto the kids, to which the protagonist replied that they would learn more that way. The teacher leaned her head on her hand, asking if the guy was pushing them too much, to which the teacher replied with a smile that the students should learn to resist pressure. Birds were flying in the bright sky. The protagonist said that judging by his observations. Raising his head up, he continued that these children were too emotional and would give up at the slightest problem. HWE explained that Jinwoo was simply afraid of letting Soan down and that's why he refused, to which Kim replied with confusion, she understood. The guy said that they needed to improve the kids' relationships and keep them a little on edge. Jinwoo and Soan appeared in front of him, crying and screaming, so everyone could hear. The guy clenched his fists and shouted that he was going to give it his all. 2 days later, Jinwoo stood with a piece of paper in his hands, bowing to the teacher. The boy asked if she would check his work, to which Seoyeon offered to look with a smile on her face. The girl happily shouted that everything was already going much better, so they should try again, while HWE was confused about what he had done. With a smirk, Seoyeon explained that the boy needed to change, and the protagonist was glad that Jinwoo had pulled himself together anyway. With a smile, he thought about what if he had pointed out the problem, while a scream was heard from behind him about the blade cutting through the opponent's neck. Hansung said with a smile that the opponent had already been pierced through when suddenly Seonyoung called it nonsense, answering how one could wield a blade when blood was gushing out of an artery. The boys suddenly began to argue when suddenly the protagonist irritably thought that they were very noisy. Seonyoung menacingly ran up to the teacher, begging him to judge the boys, who of them won. HWE smiled and asked the student to decide rock, paper, scissors, which surprised the student. The teacher added that whoever wins wins, since it's his judgment. Kim appeared behind them, shouting loudly. Seoan asked in surprise if this was what she told them, to which Kim happily shouted, yes. The teacher threw the book on the table, saying that it was a standard student contract. She wiped the sweat from her face, saying that she had used this contract herself before, so it needed to be edited point by point for the students. The students began to look at the content in shock, while Kim apologized for the shortness since she studied with her father. Jinwoo asked if she had made a contract with her father, to which Hui replied that relationships between a student and a teacher often go beyond blood ties, which usually ends in lawsuits. Kim added that this is if you're lucky, since there was a stabbing just recently, which is not surprising. The teacher said that a woman had forced her niece to do her bidding for 10 years in exchange for her education. She said that the girl would most likely be acquitted, but still, which shocked Jinwoo. Seoan smiled and said that if he had a problem, he should use his words instead of a knife and they would try to fix the problem together, when suddenly the boy shouted loudly that he was not going to cut her. Jinwoo held books in his hands, saying that he was reading and did not understand a word, to which Seoan agreed with him since her grandfather had never told her about contracts. The student replied that he would have told her that it was okay if he understood anything, when Kim suddenly asked if they were not going to write down the terms of the contract. The girl lowered her hand with the paper down, answering that they would write it down. As she began writing, she added that it would be without unnecessary complications. So the first point was that Seoan would teach Jinwoo all the magic inherited from his grandfather, including the unique magic, a navigator for everyone. The next 2 points stated that Seoan acknowledged Jinwoo's ownership of the magic stated earlier, and the choice of a successor would be made through discussion between the guys. And in the end, Seoan wrote that in the event of someone's death, they have the right to independently choose a successor. The girl immediately broke the pen in half and put her fingerprint on the paper. Kim carefully watched her every move. Seoan said that everything was ready when suddenly the teacher was indignant. Was this really her contract? The student nodded, saying that nothing more was needed, after which she asked Jinwoo if he wanted to add anything. The guy asked if he could really choose the successors. He immediately put his fingerprint, hoping that there would be no complications, because this was her grandfather's magic, so if a more talented person appeared, the guy would teach him. Kim asked with a trembling voice if the guys thought it would be worthwhile to write more details in the contract, because it was a document with legal force. Seoan handed her the paper with a smile, saying that Kim could certify this document, because with the approval of the Archmage, no legal problems should arise. The teacher was very excited, while Hui thought that if one of the guys decided to betray, then this would serve as a good experience. Seoan ran up to the main character with the document, asking him to put his fingerprint too. She explained this by saying that 3 is a lucky number, so later she would ask the director to sign it too. The guy took a pen in his hands and began to carefully sign the document. He confidently wrote his name. After finishing, Hui looked at the paper, thinking that no one would be able to ignore this contract with the signatures received. Hui went out into the yard. Raising the mug to his mouth, the protagonist thought about how nice it was. Closing his lips, the protagonist asked himself why it was so peaceful here. After the guy asked why the world was so peaceful despite the fact that the end of the world would come in 20 years, and Soken, with his mouth wide open, responded and said that Hunter Lee was investigating this matter. Sitting at the computer, Soken reminded that there would be a practical test soon and asked how the children were doing, to which Hui replied that he did not know about the rest, he was only in charge of the magic class. Hearing the interlocutor's question about why Hui was so cold, and that his job as a teacher was to watch over all the children, the protagonist smirked and thought that maybe he shouldn't chat with him. With his hand on the keyboard, Soken said that it didn't seem like the protagonist was overloaded with anything right now, and that the rune lessons were on hold because the kids were preparing for the test. To which Hui asked the man if he hadn't been the one to hand over all the preparation to him, and added that Soken knew a lot about the dungeons, so why waste that knowledge? The man replied that Soan was the only one teaching magic anyway, and Hui frowned and said that was why he helped look after the kids when he had the chance. Smiling widely, Soken asked in a long voice if that was true. Sitting at the computer, the man continued to tell Hui's teacher to try harder. Putting his mug down, the protagonist thought that even if his hunter's instincts were rubbish, then why was he so worried? Hui pursed his lips and suggested that maybe it was because there was no work here. The protagonist folded his hands in front of him and wondered if there was anyone better than him who could balance work and life, and continued that his vacation was coming up and wasn't it normal for people to forget about it when they were focused on work, and then heard someone shout loudly. Opening the door, the protagonist saw Jinwoo shouting that he could do it and that he succeeded, and asked him why him. Hui lowered his eyebrows when he heard the student ask if the teacher had seen it. Seoeon was standing on the field with the magical glow, and she said that this was her grandfather's magic. The protagonist opened his mouth and asked if this was already a unique magic, and wondered if Jinwoo was a genius. Seoeon smiled and said no, not at all, to which Hui thought that maybe he was wrong. The protagonist's feet were enveloped in a magical veil, and the girl said that her grandfather used her magic to create light in dark places, and added that magic was also useful for revealing traps, because with this magic you can see what is hidden. A glow formed around the protagonist's shoes. Seoeon, with her eyes wide, said that magic was simply incredible. The girl laughed loudly and asked if Hui agreed with this. Soken appeared and enthusiastically assessed the magic. Taking a look at the girl, the protagonist answered her in the affirmative, to which she responded. Seoeon lowered her head, hearing the protagonist's question about how things were going with mana analysis. The girl confusedly replied that she was working on it, to which Hui, with lowered eyebrows, asked if Master Kim taught her this. With the corners of her lips lowered, Seoeon answered no, the master taught her. The girl continued that she simply did not understand and that her mana was very different from what her grandfather had talked about, to which the teacher remained silent with his lips pressed together. Hui widened his eyes and thought that he was impressed that Seoeon was able to imitate light magic with that type of mana, and continued that the girl was simply a genius, a true gem. Seoeon clutched the notebook to her chest, and the protagonist thoughtfully told her not to get into such complexities. Extending his hand forward, Hui told the girl not to get hung up on the concept of light and shadow and to think of it as a separate element, since Seoeon was good at basic magic, to which she hesitantly replied that it was different from basic magic. Hui lowered himself down and extended his hand toward the ground. The protagonist lowered his head and said that the application part was the same. Pointing his hand at the hole in the ground, the protagonist asked Seoeon to try filling it with water. Hearing the teacher's question about whether she could handle such an easy task, the girl, with her mouth wide open, hesitantly agreed. Putting her hand forward, Seoeon created many streams of water. Hui told her to boil it now, and the girl, with her mouth wide open, did so. Hearing that she needed to boil the water even more, the girl closed her eyes. From the power of her magic, the water transformed into fire, and the teacher stopped her. Looking at the burning hole, Hui asked if she now understood, to which she remained silent. The teacher told Seoeon to now think about why she can use light magic, the opposite of dark, to which the girl, with the corners of her lips downturned, looked at the protagonist. Imagining fire over water, Hui said that he was not sure since he was not a magician, but water and fire are opposite elements, and added what about their formulas. With her mouth slightly open, Seoeon spoke these formulas in confusion. Raising his hand, Hui said that sometimes she could create the opposite effect by simply using the formula in reverse, and told the girl to think about it now. Seoeon brought her hand to her face and spoke the teacher's words. The protagonist dug a hole with his foot and said that the girl would have to figure out the rest herself, but if she didn't understand, she could ask Teacher Kim, to which she hesitantly asked if she could. Hui put his finger on Seoeon's forehead, and she continued that she could just ask him. The teacher, pointing his finger at the girl, repeated that he had already said that he didn't understand since he wasn't a mage. The protagonist turned his head and thought that for some reason Seoeon was scared when her bangs fell. Looking at the empty classroom, the protagonist said that there were originally supposed to be 10 students in the first generation of test subjects, but now there are 8 of those kids left. But he doesn't know exactly how many dropped out after the Myeongdong incident, and added that even now the classroom isn't that crowded, and he wonders what it was like in the original timeline. Hui walked into the classroom with the students and thought that he probably would have dropped out. Some ears of grain were seen fluttering in the wind, and it was said that the students were currently worried, and that they were supposed to struggle for a few more years before changing the academy's name to a hunting academy. Plants were seen on the ground, and Hui continued that, to be honest, this name sounds much worse than the previous one, but they continue to discuss it, reminding the protagonist of the students who died in the events of the past. The protagonist walked up to a student who formed magic between her hands. Hui, with his hands behind his back, turned to Hyun, to which she responded in fear. The teacher told her that she needed more concentration, to which Hyun, with her mouth wide open, asked him again. Hui said that a hunter must maintain his concentration in any situation, to which the girl, frowning, shouted that she was a healer, not a hunter. The protagonist asked that healers don't go underground and asked the girl to try again, to which she closed her eyes and did as he asked, making an effort. Hui looked at her with his eyebrows lowered. Putting his hands in his pockets, the teacher asked how her younger sister was, to which Hyun said her sister's name, and the protagonist continued that he heard that her sister went with the principal to register as an awakened. The girl's eyes turned white. She asked if it was true, and said that it was her younger sister. Hui's eyes widened, asking what was wrong, and Hyun sadly asked him not to remind her, since she didn't know where her sister got such ideas from. The girl continued that she barely managed to stop her sister from putting her feet in the ice, to which the teacher frowned and asked again. Putting her hand to her face, Hyun said that her sister was mumbling something about helping the circulation of mana with this cooling method, and added that something would come into her head. Hui pursed his lips and thought that maybe that was why he had been worried for the past few days. The girl remembered how Jiyeon decided to clear her stomach yesterday and ate cabbage all day, and asked if she had told him about the congestion in her veins, then added that her sister had said that she couldn't do anything about it and needed a new method. Hui patted the sad student on the back. The protagonist thought about how she would be dragged to one of these cult training centers, and that he couldn't lose his future slave like that, when suddenly the teacher came into the classroom and asked how their training was going. Hui grinned. It was heard that there was no need to worry about such things, and the protagonist saw in a dream that he was running after a small creature with a net. The protagonist, sitting on the bed, heard his name being called. Hui, turning his head, listened to him decide to look at his homework, and the protagonist wrote about his future profession, asking what it meant. Turning his head, the protagonist asked him what he called himself a hunter, not understanding what his job was, to which Soken replied that he would like to hear it from him. Hui, lowering his leg, said that he just wanted a more stable job, and the guy agreed with him. The protagonist, looking at Soken, said that he did not want to be ordered what to do, so he wanted to take a high position to command others, but only employment in private companies is unstable. The guy, holding a paper, asked where he learned about unstable, to which Hui replied that from the news. The protagonist said, moving his foot, that's why he would become a civil servant. The protagonist, looking to the side, said that he wouldn't be president, it was too hard for him, he liked the job of a manager who shifted responsibilities to others. Hui, exhaling, said that he had heard that the salary of a civil servant was low at first, but there was nothing to be done, you couldn't achieve everything at once, and Soken was at a loss. He held his hand to his face. Stroking the protagonist's head, the guy said that it was good since he wanted it so much. Hui, sitting on the bed, listened to him say that he would do everything to make his dream come true. The back of the protagonist's head appeared, and he could be heard being addressed. Looking at Hui, Hunter Jiyeon asked why he didn't enter the academy, and the guy answered because he wanted to be a civil servant, not a hunter. The girl, opening her mouth wide, said what nonsense, and does the gentleman know about it? She raised her hand and suggested going to a friendly sparring match, which the guy declined, saying that he had an exam next week. Jean, smiling brightly, said that hunters don't need exams. Holding the backpack with his hand, Hui said that then he would be as stupid as she was, which made the girl angry. The protagonist looked at his watch and said that it seemed like they managed to clear the dungeon, but not without difficulties. Putting the papers on the table, he said that if they returned alive after working under Jean's leadership, then they were ready to become professional hunters, asking why they decided to become hunters at all and why they wanted to develop in this direction. Looking at the interlocutors, he told them to ask themselves and think about this question. The protagonist, standing at the table, heard the question of why he did not become a hunter with his skills. Smiling, Hui answered because he did not like fights. Moving his shoe, he added that, not to mention, he was not ready to work for pennies. The protagonist's sneakers appeared. He, standing at the crosswalk, thought that he had come to school to see Jean on emotions. Looking at the red light, he asked himself what now. Lowering his eyebrows, he was surprised. On the other side of the road stood Jean Jr. Putting his hands in his pockets, the protagonist thought that she was still carried away by that nonsense. The woman in glasses, raising her hand to her mouth, asked if she was really interested, to which the girl asked her again. She, pointing her finger at the paper, said that it seemed to her that Jean was interested in this article and she could tell a little more in detail. Hui, hearing that she needed to learn from an expert if she did not want to harm herself, turned his head to the traffic light with displeasure. There were zeros on the dial. The protagonist ran quickly and called Jean Jr. The girl looked at the teacher and was happy to see him. Raising her hand, the woman in glasses asked what he was doing there. She folded her palms and asked if he was the girl's teacher, admiring how handsome he was. The protagonist, putting his leg forward, asked who she was, and the woman apologized for completely forgetting to introduce herself. She was holding a card that said she was the leader of a group named MANHWA. The woman handed the card to Hui, saying that she was sure he wouldn't be able to fully understand the nature of her activities by the name, and he thought it was a typical cult. The protagonist, standing next to the younger HW, listened to MANHWA say that they hold various events for children, organize volunteer work, summer camps, adding that many people are experiencing difficulties because of what is happening in the dungeons, and they can also advise and help. With her mouth slightly open, she said that people come to them with a request like the protagonist's, to which the guy clarified from her. Stretching out her hand, MANHWA continued that adults who work with children often come to them, and they think about how best to help their wards. HW, holding the card in his hands, listened to her know that no one in this world can be trusted, but she assures him that he can trust them. Pointing to the card, she asked if he saw the inscription of the Gengi branch, saying that their branches are scattered throughout the country, and also sponsored by the government. The protagonist began to lower the card. Putting it in his pocket, he turned to Jion Jr. Looking at her, the protagonist asked if her sister told her to return home immediately after classes, and she became upset. Pointing to the road, HW added that she should not be distracted by all sorts of nonsense and let her go where she was going. Jion the younger, glowing with a green aura, said goodbye. MANHWA, with her mouth slightly open, heard that he thought that she would not let her go, and asked him again. Adjusting her glasses, she said that if he heard a few good words, he would be able to help her. Seeing how the woman put her hand in the bag, HW thought that a school teacher was a better catch than a 16-year-old girl. MANHWA, pointing to the tablet, told him to look at their association. Looking at it, she said that all these companies sponsor them and believe that they work for the benefit of people. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist thought. He, looking at the woman, said that to be honest, he is not a teacher. Looking to the side, the protagonist continued that it so happened that he became one and did not finish who he originally was. MANHWA, hearing the question of whether she had heard of the preparatory school for future hunters, a place where young ones are trained, lowered her glasses. The woman, raising her hand to her chin, interrupted and said that she had seen it on the news, asking if he taught there. HW, sighing, answered in the affirmative and added that considering how much responsibility he had, it was not such an easy job. Clenching her fist, the woman said that she knew, and he must have been through a lot, and asked if he was a hunter too. The protagonist, looking at the woman, said that he did, but his rank was low, to which MANHWA replied that oh well, the main thing was his dedication to his students. She, turning off the tablet, offered to drink a cup of coffee. They walked along the road, and the woman said that he would listen to her and learn about how to train his charges. MANHWA, looking at HW's open mouth, thought that he was a newbie and a low-ranking young hunter. While drinking coffee, she thought that it had been a little over a month since he became a model school teacher. The woman, smiling maliciously, said to herself that he was still embarrassed to hear himself addressed as a teacher, but it was obvious how much he cared about his students. Looking at the cute protagonist, she told herself that someone who cared about their students and was directly connected to the hunter tracking them was a great prey. HW stood in front of Soken and said that it was the National Society for New Minds and Spirits, to which the interlocutor asked him again. Taking the business card in his hand, Soken asked where the protagonist got it from. The protagonist, lowering his eyebrows, said that a woman on the street gave it to him, and added that he met her while she was talking to Hyun's younger sister. Soken, raising his hand with the business card, asked again if he was talking about Jion, to which HW confirmed his words and said that she needed to be watched like a hawk, and asked if the interlocutor shouldn't be keeping an eye on her. The guy answered that technically, he was more of a trusted guardian, to which the protagonist, lowering his eyebrows, said that he was, nevertheless. Recalling the image of the woman in glasses, the protagonist thought about how she was very happy to hear that he was worried about the mental state of the children, and that she even gave him a lecture plan and offered to come to them during his free time. Raising his eyebrows, his partner asked if HW wanted to contact those, what's their name, and the interlocutor reminded him that it was the National Society for New Minds and Spirits. Opening his mouth, the protagonist said that this was true and he wanted to talk to them, adding that since he had already talked to that madam, someone else could go. HW continued that it could be a teacher like him, to which Soken, with his mouth wide open, was surprised. A device on the protagonist's leg appeared, and he said that he was currently on probation, and the interlocutor replied that if he went without warning, then there would be problems. Hearing Soken say that everything was fine now, HW's eyes widened and he wondered if the other man trusted him too much. The protagonist lowered his hands and remained silent, to which Soken asked if there was something wrong. The teacher turned his head and said that everything was fine and he just didn't think he was good at that kind of thing. The other man asked what HW was talking about, and he lowered his head and replied that he was collecting information, searching, and all that. Soken leaned back in his chair and asked why that was, to which the protagonist replied that he could because he had no talent. The two heroes continued to look at each other in silence. Soken pointed his finger and held back his anger. Suddenly, a loud laugh was heard, creating a wind in the street. Soken, wiping away tears from his laughter, sighed. HW's eyes turned white. He asked what the interlocutor was laughing at, to which the interlocutor asked what it meant that the protagonist would not be able to handle such tasks. Raising his eyes, the protagonist thoughtfully said that he had done many things. Looking at the interlocutor from under his forehead, Soken asked if he had ever infiltrated locations to collect the necessary information. Folding his arms, Hui replied that this was not his job, and the interlocutor choked. Leaning his hand on the table, Soken asked if the ARC knew about this. The guy put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and told him not to worry. Keeping his hand on the protagonist's shoulder, Soken said that place, national something there. And Hui said that he had already repeated 100 times that this was a national society of new minds and spirit, and the interlocutor, remembering this, agreed. Soken told the teacher to go and find out more about them, to which Hui, lowering his eyebrows, repeated that he had already said that he could not do that. The interlocutor turned away from the protagonist and said that he had already told Hui that he had nothing to worry about, since he had great motivation in the form of children, so he would succeed, to which the protagonist thought about his words in confusion. Soken smirked and said that the teacher was underestimating himself. The guy stopped abruptly and, with his mouth slightly open, asked if Hui would get into any trouble. He continued that if the protagonist came into close contact with others, he might be recognized, to which Hui smiled and said that maybe he shouldn't then. Soken smirked and asked if it was true that the teacher had a plan for this case. The guy opened his mouth wide and shouted that since the protagonist was freely walking around the city, he expected a similar outcome, and added that of course Hui had a plan, why did he even ask? Gritting his teeth, the protagonist began to speak. Lowering his head, he admitted that he was wearing a mask. Hui continued that not many people knew his face, to which Soken, raising his eyebrows, said that then there was definitely no reason to worry. Opening the refrigerator, Soken told Hui not to make up unnecessary things, to stay there for a while and leave because they did not need unnecessary risks now, and the protagonist agreed with this. Soken knelt down and told his interlocutor to make sure that he had his phone with him. The guy looked for something in the refrigerator, asked if his partner was a dinosaur, and how it happened that he did not have a cell phone, then asked what Hui does in his free time. The protagonist lowered his head and replied that he was preparing a curriculum, to which the other asked him again. Frowning, Hui asked how someone could teach children without a lesson plan, to which the other asked in confusion. The protagonist widened his eyes and shouted that the children needed to be told in detail about the weaknesses of monsters and how to carry out a purge, to which Soken replied that he was not good at explaining things. The protagonist's eyes turned white and he asked if his partner thought that others were so good at this, to which he replied that he had completely forgotten about his plans. Watching Soken run towards the door, Hui said that he was not finished yet and thought that he was the director. Why the hell was he running away? It was said that a training purge was taking place in the dungeon that day, and near the small building, someone was heard asking when they would contact him, and he was told that after the training was over. While examining Hui's leg, Yimin worriedly asked why he was so calm as always. The protagonist stood with his arms down, and the girl said that he was not wearing any armor at all. Frowning, she asked Mr. Hui to speak frankly with her. Holding the device on the protagonist's leg, Yimin asked what his rank was, and added that even if he awakened illegally, there should be some idea of him. Smirking, Hui asked if she had seen his license, and said that he was a D rank, to which the girl was seriously indignant. Lowering her head, Yimin said that of course, this was the only way to not arouse suspicion. With the corners of her lips down, Hui continued to listen to how Seong had to put in a lot of effort to fabricate all the documents related to his past. Sitting in front of Yimin, the protagonist asked what kind of person Misan was that she could create someone's life in a couple of days, to which the interlocutor replied that she had once been interested too. Remembering how Misan had told her that it was better for the girl not to know who she was, Yimin said that was her answer. Looking at the device on the protagonist's leg, the girl asked if he thought the children would pass the training. Crossing his legs, Hui replied that the guild had cleared the dungeon in advance, and if they couldn't pass it, then they should think about whether they really wanted to become hunters that badly. Letting go of the device, Yimin said that the protagonist had never taught the children how to choose a squad leader, to which he asked if she knew how many of them had already been to the dungeons and why they needed to be taught. The girl heard that some of the children had been in the guild as well, and, remembering this, she raised her hand. Hui closed his lips when he heard that Hansung and Hyunwook knew nothing about the cleansing. The protagonist asked about Hyunwook, to which Yimin widened her eyes and asked him again. The girl asked if the protagonist knew that Hyunwook was also from the guild, to which he smiled and asked if she was serious. Remembering the image of Hyunwook, Hui wondered if that pig was really in the guild. Grinning, the protagonist thought about how, despite the fact that Hyunwook was a victim, he acted like an idiot and got injured for it. Yimin removed the device from her leg and said that everything was ready, and in response to this she received gratitude. Closing her eyes, the girl said that she was leaving the children with Hui. Grinning, the protagonist remained silent. Standing in the company of the other students, Seo-eun called out to the protagonist. Looking at Hyunwook, Hui thought that he was a damn bastard and a little pig. The protagonist grinned evilly and told the children to go, thinking to himself that this time he would make sure that Hyunwook behaved like a human and not like an animal. A young girl holding a tablet greeted him and introduced herself as Soyeon. She represents the Dungeon Department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Security of South Korea. The protagonist had sweat on his face. He shook his hand and said his name, to which Soyeon replied that she was glad to meet him, asking if he had prepared the documents for the raid. Taking out the paper, HWE said that it was a report on the cleanup of the dungeon, as well as his license and the licenses of his students. He, lowering his head, thought that she looked familiar. Looking at the way she held the tablet, he continued that it was as if they had met somewhere before. Looking at the smiling protagonist, she asked if everything was okay. HWE, holding his sword tightly, replied that he was just a little nervous about the raid, and the girl said that Hunter Hong had praised the trainees' skills, and the protagonist said that this did not mean that they should let down their guard. Sohn, smiling, agreed with him. Standing behind her, Soken furiously asked why she was yelling at him all the time, but was talking so nicely to Mr. HWE. She, opening her mouth wide, shouted that she would not have to scold him if he did everything right, and the protagonist recognized her voice. He, looking at her outstretched finger, thought that she was the lecturer who was present on the day of the attack on the lab. Closing her eyes, the girl said that the check was over and asked him to make sure that he could immediately evacuate the dungeon if necessary, and the protagonist never thought that he would see her like this again, and during this time she had gone through many difficulties, but you can't tell from her. HWE, wide-eyed, admired her, and she calmly said that usually hunters are sent to help resolve such situations, but they are currently in short supply. Soken, standing next to the car, asked if there was such a need since he was standing in front of her, to which she replied that such were the regulations. Sitting in the car, the students heard that why such a regulation was needed at all, having received an answer, do not ask stupid questions. The protagonist, looking at them, thought that they would soon burst into tears. He, directing his gaze to Sohn, said that it was time for them to go, and the girl answered positively. The protagonist, bringing the radio to his mouth, said the date and the dungeon number. Looking at the portal, he said that 9 participants were ready and introduced himself as instructors in the training of hunters. The students appeared and HWE said their names and the current time, saying that they were entering the dungeon. The protagonist, lowering his hands, turned to the students. Placing his hand on the god, he continued that he would not be providing any assistance and that the evaluation would depend on their personal contribution during the cleanup. One of the students raised his hand and asked if he could clarify how the results of this test would affect them. HWE, with his mouth wide open, said that if they had low scores, they would have to personally talk to the principal and also attend remedial classes with him. Looking at the surprised boys, he continued that the lower their score, the more often they would meet with them in additional classes. The protagonist turned around and said that he was leaving them here and that they were on their own now. The gentleman walked through the trees. One of the students, his eyes wide, asked what they should do now. Their boots appeared and someone continued that they were told that the healer should be in the center, and it was heard that first of all they needed to destroy the core of the dungeon. Heravk, looking at the students, said that according to the scouts' information, the core was in the eastern part of the forest. He opened his mouth and added that they had to pass by Pixie to get to him, asking if they remembered about the fairy. Seoan, holding a paper, heard the question about the runes that hide magic and replied that they were here. The students, walking through the forest, said that it was time to move. The protagonist, standing behind a tree, thought that it was a little unpleasant to just stand aside and watch. Seeing how the students stopped, the protagonist said to himself that this was a forest-type dungeon, so there were only trees around. Looking at Pixie, he added that these fairies were only smart enough to put out a fire, but there was not a single source of water in the dungeon. Hyunwook struck Pixie, and HWE continued that it was safe to make a fire and use fire. A trail of blood appeared, and the protagonist said that if they caught this detail, they would do 100%. He lowered his eyebrows at the joyful shouts and said that none of them would get 100%. Pixie opened his mouth in anger. Hansung swung his sword and hit a fairy. The students fought back and Hyunwook shouted that they were surrounded. He grabbed one of the fairies and told the mages to use a shield. The students raised their hands. Seoyeon was covered in a blue aura. Hyunwook, holding his weapon, shouted for them to finish them off. Hansung struck Pixie several times. The students put their hands on their hips and Hyunwook told them to double-check that all the monsters were dead. He narrowed his eyes and added that this was their third battle and asked how they were doing with the rune papers. Seoyeon, wide-eyed, replied that they had already checked, there was no problem. A path was visible and it was heard that they would soon reach the core, and according to the intelligence, soon. The protagonist, peeking out from behind a tree, heard that no one ruled out that the location of the core in the C-rank dungeon could change at any time, so they couldn't let their guard down. The students, walking along the path, said that it seemed much easier than other dungeons. Looking at Seoyeon, Hyun asked if she had been in dungeons before, to which the girl replied that she had been with her grandfather, but they had only protected a rank ones. Sungjin, lowering her eyebrows, said that she had followed her teacher to the C-rank dungeon as a training exercise. Seonyeong, with his mouth wide open, listened to how it didn't stand out in any way, and she thought that the place they were in now was much easier to pass, to which he exclaimed that this was an indicator of their superior skills. Hui closed his eyes and, hearing that it was so easy for them, thought how self-confident they were. Hyunwook, with the corners of his lips slightly open, said that despite what this man said, the director would not have let them in here if he doubted their skills. The protagonist, with his pupils wide open, listened to the end of the conversation, as he also said that all the nearby dungeons had been checked and said to himself that he had never called him a teacher. The protagonist, looking around the corner, continued to listen, that therefore, he thought they had been cleared out in advance so that they could pass, to which Hui said that this was another point in Hyunwook's piggy bank. The students, lifting their legs, said that pixies always moved in packs and did not find it strange that they had only come across 8. Hyunwook narrowed his eyes and said that his warning that he would not interfere no matter how dangerous the situation was nothing more than a bluff to make them nervous. The boy slightly opened his mouth and added that he was standing somewhere behind a tree and rolling his eyes because they could see right through him. The protagonist, with his hands in his pockets, came out from behind the tree. He lowered his eyebrows and said that since they thought the dungeons were easy, then why not increase the difficulty level? The protagonist, looking at their backs, thought that he would teach them to watch their language. The boy stood in the middle of a burning city and was told that unfortunately, most tragedies in the world begin in dungeons. A man approached the boy and turned to him, asking if he was okay and if he had just woken up. The man smirked and asked the boy's name. Looking at the ruined building, the boy replied that his name was Hyunwook, to which the man said that they would now be acquainted. As the boy looked into the distance, the man introduced himself as the guild leader and asked if he would like to join them, adding that it was stupid to waste his ability since the boy needed to learn how to use it properly. The guild leader smiled and said that he would not charge for training. The boy held up a piece of paper, and the man said that he would simply learn new skills in their guild, and in the future he could become a hunter. The leader narrowed his eyes, and Hyunwook thought that it took him only a short time to understand the meaning of the man's gaze before everything around him turned into hell. Adult Hyunwook stood with the corners of his lips downturned. As Hyunwook sat down at his desk, Hui remembered that the boy was captured by monsters while saving Sonyeon. While the protagonist was thinking about whether to thank the boy, Hyunwook decided to approach him. Seeing Hyunwook behind him, the protagonist exclaimed his name in surprise. Gritting his teeth, Hui said that he thought the lecture on runes was too tiring for the guy. Frowning, Hyunwook thought that instead of the stern gaze of the teacher, he saw Hui looking at him like a thing, like he was cannon fodder, after which Hyunwook felt very disgusted. The defeated pixies appeared. Hyun said that the pixies were getting smaller, to which Hyunwook, gritting his teeth, replied that it was because they were approaching the core. The guy continued that the faster they finished, the faster they would leave here, because the dungeon was not that difficult, so that person could come up with any excuse to take off their glasses, to which Hanun, wiping her face with a rag, said that she thought he was definitely capable of such a thing. The girl's eyes turned white as she asked if her teammates had seen the man laughing while they were rolling around in the mud, adding that after she had run for so long he had said it wasn't enough, she felt like punching him, to which Sonan replied that they all wanted to punch him. The girls followed Hyunwook, and Hanainen said that she had once asked the principal if they could at least slow down a little, to which the boy replied that given the principal's personality, he didn't think he would listen. The girl opened her mouth wide and shouted that there wasn't even a place to take a shower and that it was terrible, to which Hyunwook asked if she had said that too, to which he had replied in the affirmative. Frowning, the boy asked if he had replied that the girl wasn't going underground to live in luxury, to which Hanainen replied that that was exactly how it was. A tear rolled down the girl's face, and Hyunwook continued that the director also said that she would see worse things when she became a hunter, so there was no need to make a fuss over dust on her clothes. Hanun, with her eyes closed, shouted that it was true and that she felt like crying, to which Seoyeon asked her to wait. The heroes looked at each other in confusion, while Seoyeon asked if they heard anything. A loud squeal of flying pixies was heard, and, drawing their weapons, they took up positions. Through this squeal, Hanun and Hyunwook swatted away the pixies. Hyun closed her eyes when one of the monsters attacked her. With his mouth wide open, Hyunwook shouted at the heroes to protect Hyun. Gritting his teeth, the boy thought about why everything happened so suddenly and asked himself how they would get out, destroy the core of the dungeon or wait for the monsters to leave on their own. Remembering the smirk of the guild leader, the boy thought that in his place, he would have made someone the main target of Pixie, the bait, and continued clearing. Looking at Hyun, Hyunwook continued that he would have made her the sacrificial lamb, because even if these were other dungeons, healers did not play a special role, they were just ballast with poor physical abilities. The boy's silhouette was enveloped in a red glow, and he, thinking about his words, realized that not long ago, the victim thrown in front of the monsters like this was him, and what was he thinking about? Hyunwook, opening his eyes, heard his name being called. Pixie's claws approached the boy's eye. Suddenly, the silhouette of a screaming monster appeared in the boy's eyes. Surrounded by blue magic, MANHWA said that the heroes were already very exhausted. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist said that it was a normal raid. The protagonist asked if Hyunwook would pull himself together, to which he stood with his mouth slightly open. The guy lowered his head, and teacher MANHWA called out to him again. The protagonist, gritting his teeth, exclaimed in fear at what he saw. The pixies were pulling Hyunwook's hair, and he was screaming. The protagonist gave the command to Jinwoo to use the shield, to which he, raising his hand, began to do so. Sunyoung, with wide eyes, set the direction to 11 o'clock. Then the teacher commanded Hanunyoung and Hyun to fight against the pixies together. Hansung, putting his hand forward, set the direction to 8 o'clock. And Seoeon, closing her eyes, heard the command to prepare a shield. After the countdown, Jinwoo formed a shield around himself, and MANHWA gave the order to take positions again. The protagonist's lips turned down, wondering if he had gone too far since he had simply lit a fire at the back of the dungeon to scare the students a little. The plants appeared, and MANHWA kept thinking that he hadn't done it because the students were annoying him, but because it was a basic method written in the tutorial that the management had sent out. And if he had known that the students wouldn't be able to handle it, he wouldn't have done anything, even though they were fighting well even now, having taken their positions. The protagonist thought that there was no need to fight everyone, he just needed to hold out until the pixies ran away and deal with the dungeon break-in. And turning towards Hyunwook, he added that something that collapsed like that must have been because of that guy. As he imagined the heroes walking among the trees, teacher MANHWA understood that from the moment they entered the dungeon, Hyunwook had been giving the orders and the others had been following his example because even during normal training, this guy was the leader. The final swing of the sword was heard, and standing under the dome, the protagonist continued that although the leader's abilities affected the success of the party, it was impossible to depend on the leader for everything. The protagonist continued to look towards Hyunwook. Getting into the car, MANHWA said that the dungeon expedition had failed, which Seokyeon was unhappy about. Hyun looked at the upset Hyunwook, and the teacher continued that the dungeon had been destroyed and asked if the inspectors had said anything about the success of the raid. A stream of cars appeared on the road, and the director replied that he would tell about it later. MANHWA glanced at the students and said that the results of the evaluation would be announced tomorrow. The students sat with their eyes closed, and the teacher said that he was curious about how important the grades were. The protagonist told everyone to disperse, and the students walked towards the doors of the building. Principal Seokyeon, teacher MANHWA, Yimin, and Hyunwook remained in the car. Turning to the student, the protagonist asked if he would go, to which he remained silent. MANHWA sighed heavily. The protagonist asked to talk to the student, after which Seokyeon and Yimin got out of the car. The rays of the sun reflected in the rearview mirror, and the teacher asked Hyunwook to tell him everything. The student remained silent, lowering his head. Frowning, MANHWA said that he would not ask anything, but if there was a problem, it would be better to solve it quickly. Clutching his pants with his hand, Hyunwook began to speak. The boy began to cry and said that he could not become a hunter. The kitchen was visible during the day. Hyunwook frowned and asked what it was. He looked at the boy and thought that he came because, according to him, the matter was urgent. Seokyeon, holding a bag in his hand, turned to Hyunwook and said that only he could look after him, to which he asked who this kid was. Taking hold of the strap of the bag, the boy's father said that it was his son, and the boy asked where he stole him from, receiving the answer that no, he had been his son for several years. As Seokyeon left, he said that he would try to return quickly after the cleanup, and he would take care of him in the meantime. Hyunwook's eyes turned white when he heard that Jiyoung was also in a dungeon abroad, so the matter was bad. The little boy's father, winking, said that he remembered him later, and after learning that he had cleared an ranked dungeon, he added that considering his character, he thought that he would be able to handle the child. Seokyeon held out his finger and said that he would find his credit card on the table and that he could spend the money on whatever he needed, to which Hyunwook clarified that he thought he would agree. Smiling broadly, the boy's father replied that he had no choice. Before Hyunwook could raise his hand, he heard him say that he would take care of his baby. The boy scratched his head in confusion. Looking at the boy, he said that he was his student and asked his name. The guild appeared, which Hyunwook founded 2 years after graduating from the academy, which everyone in the city was talking about for only a year, and he was incredible. The leader narrowed his eyes and did not finish. The founder of the guild bent over, coughed, and said that he was already feeling better. The boy, holding out the bottle, offered him a sip, to which the leader replied that everything was fine. Watching Hyunwook drink water, the protagonist thought that he was one of the most famous hunters in Korea and the head of the guild. MANHWA, closing his eyes, was perplexed. Hyunwook, wiping his mouth, asked if he was from the management agency and what his name was. He, looking at the grinning guy, asked if they had met before, to which the protagonist replied that he was glad to meet him, and, having said his name, finished that he saw him for the first time. The head, opening his mouth, said that he had heard his name somewhere before. The protagonist, smiling, said that they were already behind schedule, it was time to go, and Hyunwook did not understand what such a rush was for. He, holding the bottle, said that he would take care of everything. The guild head began to drink something. Hui, with his mouth wide open, realized it was alcohol and shouted that he was crazy. They had already passed the gate, and Hyunwook offered him a sip, and the guy refused. Holding the open bottle, Hyunwook said that his brain doesn't work well until he drinks. Smiling widely, he added that this is why he always takes alcohol before a raid. Putting it in his sweater, the leader said that they should finish quickly and then they can drink together, which shocked the protagonist, saying that next time he would just quit. Hyunwook, holding his head, cried. Hui, sitting in the car, wondered how much longer he could whine. Smiling, he called the guy. The guy, choking on tears, said that he was not worthy of being a hunter. The protagonist, holding the bottle, told him to take it, take a sip and calm down, and the guy thanked him. Looking at the street, the protagonist thought that there was nothing wrong with tears, it was not shameful, but in fact, he could not stand people who only whine, thinking that this was enough for forgiveness, and did not even realize their mistakes, and if he were an employee of the management agency, he would have scolded him severely. Looking at the guy, Hui said to himself that there was a reason why he was soft with him now. Opening his mouth, he asked why he thought so, and understood that he had to raise a real person out of him. Hyunwook, holding a bottle, began to say what he heard, to which the protagonist interrupted, asking that he was from a guild. The guy, closing his eyes, said that from his lips it sounded like he was a professional. Folding his arms, Hyunwook replied that he lived for 3 years as bait and acted like that. The protagonist, looking away, imagined what he had gone through. He, sitting in the car, continued that this is a typical story about how a person at a young age is drawn into a scam plot. Looking at the boy, he added that no child should have to go through this, and Hyunwook said that he swore to become a real hunter and gather the same guys around him to form his own guild, help people and prevent bad things from happening. Imagining how they were attacked by pixies, he added that an idea came to his mind. Looking forward, he continued that you can use those who are useless in battle as bait. The boy, lowering his head, said that he hated the guild leader and he thought so before until he did the same thing. Gritting his teeth, he said that it was disgusting. Hui, looking at the boy, said that he knew someone. He grew up in the same conditions as the boy, thinking that they should use a different approach, different from the one Sohan had. The protagonist, lowering his eyebrows, said that he could retell his own story from the past, judging by the fact that he said nothing. The protagonist, sitting in the passenger seat, said that like him, he signed a contract in his youth, not knowing that it was possible to live differently, and eventually escaped thanks to the help of one kind person, adding that the guy also wanted to help people just like Hyunwook. Turning around, Hui said that his situation was very similar to the guy's situation. Closing his eyes, the protagonist added that he faced the same difficulties, thinking that the guy was him. Standing behind the adult Hyunwook, knowing his story, the protagonist could better understand him, that he was never able to get rid of the shackles of the past, and that old guild, the disaster in Myeongdong and memories of school. Remembering how Jiyeon looked at him, he asked her how she managed to shut him up, was it a special approach, and thought that she might not have warned him, told him about the past, and now he feels like a bad person. Hui folded his arms and said that it was funny. Hyunwook showed up, a guy who used to crawl around drunk, but then started donating funds every year, paid compensation to the victims' families on behalf of the guild, and even became the head of eradicating illegal activities in the dungeons. The protagonist, clenching his jaw, remembered that Hyunwook got stabbed in the past because he covered for those who embezzled funds from the guild and said that he moved on with his life. Student Hyunwook, looking at the protagonist, asked for what purpose, to which he answered, to help children who went through the same difficulties as him. Hui, holding the tablet, remembered that he once asked why he didn't give up and asked the guild leader if he understood that he wouldn't get any reward since there were other people who could take care of him just as well, receiving the answer that the question was rude. Holding the bottle in front of him, the adult Hyunwook said that his father asked the same thing. Opening his mouth, he added that it didn't matter, asking if this was why he stayed up all night, which the protagonist didn't say. Narrowing his eyes, the leader clarified if he was curious, or if he was so curious that he wanted to crawl out of his skin, which made Hui angry. Holding the bottle, Hyunwook thought that he would have to answer anyway. Putting his hand in his pocket, he said that he was a man of high moral principles, and could do terrible things if he wanted to achieve something, and the protagonist didn't understand why. The guild leader, lowering his eyebrows, answered that he didn't want to hit the bottom. The protagonist, looking at Hyunwook, thought that he had to prove that he was above this, and why shouldn't he do the same? Squinting his eyes, Hui said that this was his life, and it was up to him to decide what to do. The guy's pupils turned white when he heard that he knew that his previous guild leader was already behind bars. Bending down, he replied that he didn't know, and the protagonist added that it was probably sad. Looking at the serious guy, HWE wanted him to show everything that he could achieve success without resorting to such nasty methods. A cafe was visible, and someone said that this is how it was. Soken chewed on the chicken and turned to HWE and said that he was very surprised when the teacher considered the cleanup a failure, because if the students could not clear even a weakened dungeon, then they will not become hunters. Taking a fork in his hand, the protagonist asked if the principal thought that the guy should undergo counseling, to which Soken asked if he was talking about Hyunwook. Raising his hand, the protagonist said that he was not only talking about Hyunwook, Hyun was bait, and added that the students were under a lot of stress. The teacher continued that he thinks that the students should at least go to a psychologist once to assess their condition, to which Soken thought, licking the bone. Throwing the bone on the table, the principal said that he would be honest with HWE and added that psychotherapy and counseling are good. Soken asked about the chances of the therapist being awakened, to which the teacher lowered his eyebrows and asked him again. Raising his hand, the director said that it was not something impossible, since the hunter could go berserk during the consultation, and asked about the chances of an awakened specialist being able to subdue the hunter. HWE looked at the interlocutors in confusion, and Yemen began to speak. The girl said that a couple of years ago, as a result of an incident, the doctor was killed by the hunter, who had a panic attack during the session, and the protagonist looked at her with the corners of his lips down. Soken took a piece of meat in his hand and said that the hunter did not do it on purpose. A newspaper appeared with the news that the hunter killed the psychiatrist, and it was said that after that, real problems began. Holding his head, HWE asked if the doctors had refused treatment, to which Yemen replied that they wanted measures to be taken to ensure their safety. A device on the protagonist's leg appeared, and Yemen said that, for example, the mana control bracelet that the interlocutor was currently wearing, to which he said that he believed that the hunters had refused. Taking a mug in her hand, the girl explained that currently, consultations can only be obtained by phone, and added that the patient will not even be able to see the doctor's face because there have been cases where hunters have tracked down their specialists. HWE thought about her words and remembered how he sat opposite the specialist with his legs tucked under him. Resting his head on his hand, the teacher thought that he could have attended consultations before he woke up, and Soken said that this way it is impossible to provide the necessary treatment, so the hunters have stopped asking for consultations. Frowning, HWE said that they were still kids, to which he was asked if it was true that everyone had licenses and were all above D rank. Licking the bone, Soken muttered that they wouldn't be able to get help. Throwing the bone onto a napkin, the principal said that if it really was an incredible shock, Hyunwook wouldn't have followed him, adding that there was no need to worry about it so much. Around the empty tables of the cafe, HWE could be heard repeating that the hunters were still kids. Raising his mug to his mouth, Soken said that he understood his concern. The principal's lips were foaming, he remembered something, and said that he had something to discuss with that organization. Opening his mouth wide, HWE repeated the name and asked if it was about time he remembered it, to which Soken asked if the teacher had said that they were trying to lure him in with child psychology or something. The protagonist's eyes turned wide at the principal's words, and Soken said that since he was going there anyway, HWE should try to get some important information for himself. Smiling widely, the principal said that maybe HWE could become a teacher psychologist in the future, to which the protagonist replied that he didn't think that was a good idea, although the school was currently short-staffed, but not that short-staffed. Pointing a finger at the interlocutor, Soken said that he did a good job with Hyunwook, so he would be perfect for the role, and HWE guessed that this meant that the salary would be higher. The principal, pretending not to hear this, asked if the teacher wanted some more beer. Raising his hand high, Soken yelled at the waiter to bring them more drinks. It got dark outside. The next day, many cars drove past the building. HWE came out of the building and wished him a good day. Taking the phone in his hand, the protagonist thought about the principal's words and how if it really was an incredible shock, Hyunwook would not have followed him. Trees appeared against the night sky, and it was said that once the hunters cross the gate, they are cut off from the outside world and the strongest survive. An empty nest was visible on the branches. The protagonist thought about how the children will graduate from school in just a few years, and after that, they will have to solve problems on their own without anyone's help, and he cannot deny the need to go through the process of struggling and overcoming difficulties alone. Putting his hand in his pocket, HWE continued that everything has a limit. Holding the phone in his hands, the teacher thought that he did not expect him to be so considerate and think about the children much more than HWE himself. The phone screen showed the news that Korea's best hunter was once again saving his country. The protagonist looked at the column that told the story of how to go from an outstanding newbie to the strongest hunter and thought about it. Looking at the phone screen, the protagonist thought that the news was full of nonsense. HWE started dialing the number on the business card. After a few rings, someone greeted him and introduced themselves as the leader of the group from the National Society for New Research and Spiritual Awakening. And the protagonist greeted him back and said that he was the teacher she met, to which MANHWA happily exclaimed, The woman said that she knew he would call, and where else would she find someone as experienced as him, to which Hui frowned, thinking that she had only met him once. The teacher walked past the buildings, and MANHWA continued to say that there was a meeting for the children who were traumatized after the dungeon, and asked if Hui would like to attend if there was time. The woman said that she was sure that the teacher would make a great contribution and asked his opinion on it, to which Hui held his hand with the phone away from himself and thought that he was not sure if this was the right decision. A car pulled up to the parking lot and a question was heard asking Hui if he was sure that he was okay with this appearance. Sitting in the car, the protagonist asked what Yimin was talking about, to which she replied that maybe they should have brought their Amy along to cheer them up, to which Hui asked the girl again. Imagining a yellow car, Yimin replied that it was her favorite car, to which Hui remained silent. Closing his eyes, the protagonist asked what good would come from attracting attention, to which the girl asked a counter question about whether Hui had used his communication with Hong for his own purposes. Smiling, Yimin said that the teacher could have let them know that he was close to the Supreme Mage, to which the interlocutor replied that his connections with the director were enough for him. The protagonist got out of the car, slamming the door, to which Yimin indignantly asked if this was his gratitude for giving him a ride. Smiling widely, the girl wished the protagonist good luck. Hui entered the building. He was greeted by an employee who asked if he had come to the lecture. Thinking that the employee had a familiar face, the protagonist nodded, and the guy asked if he could find out his name. The protagonist said his name, and the employee began to look for it on the list. The guy took out stickers from his pocket and said that the group leader invited Hui here. Smiling, the employee handed the protagonist a sticker and told him to go to a small auditorium on the second floor, and also to stick the sticker on his phone case and show it when he entered. The protagonist looked at the guy in bewilderment, with the corners of his lips turned down. The employee asked if something was wrong, to which Hui, smirking, replied that nothing was wrong. Taking the boy by the shoulder, the protagonist said that he looked like someone he knew, to which the boy replied that he understood. Frowning, Hui thought that this boy didn't just look exactly like his friend. Imagining the face of the employee, the protagonist realized that it was the same person. Remembering how little Hui read a book in the room with the number 3, the protagonist thought that he wondered where the number 3 went after the unsuccessful end of the tests, and wondered if he had really been here all this time. Hui introduced number 3, who was the oldest child in the lab. He was 15 years old at the time. The boy had a crown hanging over him, and the protagonist continued that since he was in the lab, the decision was made to end the experiments at 13, and number 3 was the oldest. The protagonist, with his eyes wide, thought that he stayed even after that because he was a good child who, according to the director's instructions, managed to handle the younger ones, or perhaps it was because the director did not like Hui and did not want him to manage the children. The protagonist, raising his hand to his mouth, said that as the eldest, he incited the children to commit misdeeds. The children's room appeared, and he said that shortly before his 16th birthday, number 3 disappeared. The protagonist, with his hands at his sides, said that this was an unfortunate turn of events, and with his departure, no one was holding him back anymore. Hui, lowering the corners of his lips, continued that they were not on very good terms, but he had managed to become attached to him. Looking at number 3, he said to himself that he never thought he would meet him again. The commentator, standing on the stage, said that each child is a unique individual, so there is no simple answer and everyone should remember this. One of the conference participants opened his mouth when he heard a question about what was important to talk about with children, and he answered that it was about love and patience. The commentator, holding the microphone, said that was true. Hui, folding his arms, heard a proposal to split into groups to have a discussion, did not understand why this was even useful. The protagonist, in a purple aura, wondered if people would be confused if they started chatting about strange things from the very beginning. Approaching the teacher, a woman in a green t-shirt said that she had not been here for a long time, to which she replied that she had been busy with work, had not had a free minute. The protagonist, lowering his eyebrows, thought that these people were somehow connected with the Ark, and this is the method used by cults to increase the number of believers, realizing that a lot had happened lately, but was proud of the diligent students. That woman raised her hand. Turning to the protagonist, she asked if he was new, receiving a positive answer. Hui, hearing that they hadn't noticed him at all, said with a smile that everything was fine with him. A discussion could be heard about the students and teachers, whether the government was somehow solving this problem, and the girl, looking at the protagonist, asked which classes he worked with, receiving the answer that he worked with the older ones. She, opening her mouth, said that she did too, and at this time the students were very sensitive. The bell rang. Hui, getting up, excused himself because he needed to go to the toilet. He walked along the corridor and thought about how he could get something useful for himself, and that he couldn't even confirm their involvement in the Ark. The protagonist, seeing the children, wondered whether he should talk to them. Lowering his eyebrows, he asked himself if he should find number 3, and he was sure that he was somehow connected to the Ark. The protagonist continued that besides, if the arc was targeting him, they would find a way to contact him themselves, and the boy, standing behind him, turned to him. Turning around, Hvidge expected this from the cult, and the boy asked if he could help with anything. He, looking at the protagonist, asked if he liked the lecture. Looking at the guy's rounded eyes, the protagonist thought that he recognized him, and a little sadly, because they spent a lot of time together in the lab. Hvidge, imagining himself as a little boy, said that if he knew that his adult version was traveling in time, he himself would go to the Ark and beg for his life. The protagonist, standing next to the guy, asked if he was a volunteer, to which he replied that he was working off his hours. Opening his mouth, he said that this was not the only reason. The boy, hearing the question why, was confused. Standing in place, he said that he also suffered because of the dungeon. The boy closed his eyes and continued that this is why he wanted to help children who had gone through the same thing he had. Smiling sweetly, Hvidge said that it was sweet of him, thinking that was what he was getting at, which made the boy very embarrassed. The protagonist, with his mouth open, said that he was responsible for students with the same experience as him, and the boy asked if they were like him. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist replied that they were, and that the guys were completely normal on the outside, but inside they were in a real storm. Hvidge looked at his interlocutor thoughtfully. Scratching the back of his head, he apologized for what he had said, and the boy said that it was not worth it. He was not against discussing it. Lowering his head, he said that at first he was disgusted to think about his experience, but now he speaks freely on this topic because he helps other children. The protagonist grinned and thought that he had good acting skills and replied that he hoped that his students would become as strong as him, to which the boy replied that it took a long time. Looking at his watch, the protagonist said that he should not rush. Straightening his jacket, he continued that it was time for him to go, and it was probably hard for the guy to talk about this topic, but he thanked him. Writing something down in a notebook, the protagonist clarified whether it was useful for him. Watching as Hvidge tore off a piece of paper, the guy replied that he was grateful for this too. Having given the sheet to the interlocutor, the protagonist said that if he needed help, then let him ask, and he was not an important bigwig, but he was still considered a hunter. The guy opened his mouth wide and exclaimed, having learned that he was a hunter. Hvidge smiled affirmatively and said to himself that he was literally giving himself up to be eaten by him, going into the lion's mouth, so let him take advantage of this chance. A field of wheat was visible. Soken, pouring boiling water, asked about number 3. Watching him put the kettle on, the protagonist said that they had no names, only numbers. Holding a mug, Soken asked about a younger brother or sister, receiving the answer, number 12. Squeezing his hand tightly, he thought that they were terrible. Looking at the interlocutor, the protagonist suggested that he investigate orphanages, and he heard that they had a sponsorship project. Looking at the corner of the room, he continued that some traces of the hasty removal of children remained in the training center, and if they were sent to different orphanages, it would be easier to avoid unnecessary attention, to which the man agreed. Putting his hand in his pocket, Soken added that he and Mrs. Kim should enter the dungeon in 2 days because there was an urgent message in Sokcho. Looking at Hvidge, he asked to take good care of the students, and the protagonist asked for how long. Soken lowered his eyebrows and replied that if it was in a rank dungeon, he could guarantee a week, but he had no information. The protagonist listened with narrowed eyes so that he wouldn't worry they would help him, and thought that wasn't Soken clearing a C-rank dungeon at that time. A house appeared and a conversation about the renovation of the building for the next year could be heard. The protagonist folded his palms and asked what about the mana control bracelet, since he didn't put it back on after clearing it. Looking at Hvidge, he asked why he was asking if he wanted to use it again, having received a negative answer. The protagonist frowned and heard that he didn't need it then. Soken extended his finger and asked if it was easier to teach the guys like that, to which the protagonist sighed in disappointment. Hvidge looked at the steam from the boiling water and asked if he could continue lecturing according to the curriculum, which surprised the interlocutor. The protagonist said, opening his mouth angrily, that he gave them to him and asked him to look at them. Light came through the window and he could hear Soken read them, and the protagonist said that he was lying. A chessboard appeared. The sun was shining brightly. Hvidge remembered Sonen's words about the students listening carefully to the teacher and Miss Kim's words about how they would soon finalize the teaching strategy. The students were already sitting in their seats, waiting for the teacher to give them more instructions. Sonen raised his hand and asked the teacher when they would find out about the grades. The teacher stood in front of the board and thought about how he had been giving marks too picky. When he was sitting in the car with Miss Kim, she had told him that the teacher should not be too strict with them. She had added that the students knew what they had done wrong and he was not sure that they needed to be scolded at all. He remembered her lecturing him on how to teach, to which he asked what the next step would be. In response, Miss Kim hit the hero in the shoulder and told him not to make fun of her. The teacher's eyes turned white. The woman added that he should put on the clothes she picked out, reproaching him for wearing sweatpants in school. The teacher, putting his hands in his pockets, asked the students what the first thing to do when exploring the dungeon was. He, raising his head, added that they should not be afraid of making mistakes when answering. Hyunwook, raising his hand, answered that they needed to collect supplies. The other students, raising their hands one by one, answered the teacher's question, talking about training and collecting information. 2 cars drove up to the academy. At this time the teacher said that the students' answers were partly correct. HWE, raising his palm, answered the students that all their answers were links in an important chain and asked who was doing all this. The students sat with their hands folded. The teacher answered his own question, saying that the leader was in charge of everything and that the students had made 2 major mistakes. Nissan opened the door to the classroom. The teacher added that the students had not chosen a leader during the raid. She stood there, smiling widely as the teacher continued to talk about the students' mistakes. The woman stood at the back of the room as the teacher continued to talk about the importance of choosing a leader even in the easiest dungeons, as well as coordinating the actions of the entire group. The teacher rolled his eyes and added that they had not actually failed the cleanup. He lowered his head and praised the students for being able to concentrate and not get confused. The teacher introduced Miss Kim, who asked him to praise the students, which he did. Nissan was still standing in the classroom as the teacher talked about how one must also think well in dungeons. The students sat in confusion when he asked them to think about their actions as a group leader. The sun was shining brightly outside, and HWE's words could be heard from the classroom, telling them to rest for a while and have a snack before meeting in the mage room. Only the teacher and Nissan remained in the classroom. She greeted the teacher and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he responded in the affirmative. She smiled widely as she listened to the teacher's question about Miss Kim and Soken. She replied that she was glad to see him too, but she didn't like the fact that he asked her directly. The woman crossed her arms over her chest. The teacher asked if they were in the Siren dungeon. She narrowed her eyes and asked him how he knew. The woman smiled as she looked at him, while he tried to find out if it was true. She turned away and said that they were indeed in the Siren dungeon off the coast of Soksho. The teacher frowned as she spoke of the many casualties in that dungeon. Hunters and civilians were hanging in the siren traps in the middle of a rescue operation. The leader was Yeeman, who later died. The hunter stood behind one of the sirens. He gritted his teeth, not taking his eyes off the siren, and couldn't understand why no one could move in front of this monster. The monster turned to the hunter, letting out a hypnotic cry. People who did not dare to pierce their ears succumbed to the influence of this hypnosis. One of the hunters approached the siren. Someone swung a sword. Blood spilled. Keeman knew that if anyone moved, the magic would subside. The hunter, entwined with vines, sat next to Keeman's dead body. This was only the first task of the agency. It was necessary to simply deal with the consequences of the tragedy of the siren nest. The woman, raising her eyebrows, turned to the teacher. She was no longer smiling and trying to understand what was wrong, but the teacher only thought that following the call of the heart would not be the most rational decision. HWE closed his eyes and only thought about the study, which was not originally planned, and most likely everything would be fine with Keeman and Soken. He sighed with relief. The woman stood with her arms folded again. He simply said that nothing special. She took a deep breath and stopped pestering the teacher with questions. The woman snapped her fingers to finally change the subject. The teacher, his mouth slightly open in surprise, listened to Mison's offer to join the guild. Rubbing her neck, she explained that she wanted to avoid unnecessary attention when announcing the runes and therefore first needed to talk about those that had the least impact. Extending her palm to the teacher, she said that being in the guild would make it easier for him to control the information, and if anything happened, the guild would take on the solution of all problems. He shook his head, saying that he was not interested. Nissan asked if he really didn't want to try, to which he responded negatively. The girl smiled and said that she wouldn't force him anyway. The guy bowed his head slightly. She put her hand on her belt and listened to the teacher's words about how he thought she was going to insist. She asked if he really wanted this. The hero shook his head in turn. The girl grinned, looking at him. Remembering the situation in which HWE fought the monster, she added that they needed to do at least something to preserve the guild's reputation. The teacher's pupils turned white because of the woman's words, who told him that they could decide anything in any case, as long as he didn't kill anyone. The teacher didn't understand why she was luring him to her in this way, but he simply responded affirmatively. Hunters on a mission in the siren's lair. One of them was walking along the vines. Soken, squinting his eyes, looked ahead. His medallion on his neck glittered. The students stood in front of the teacher in the classroom while he asked them if they had thought about what he asked them to do during the break, also adding that there was no such thing as a perfect dungeon and that they had to think quickly to come up with a strategy. He looked at the students and asked who would go first. The only sound was the ticking of a clock. No one wanted to go first. Hyunwook frowned, as the teacher said he knew he would be the leader and needed to pick a deputy. He turned his head slightly and said that Hansen would be the deputy since he already had experience in going through dungeons, to which the teacher responded approvingly. A chessboard was shown, symbolizing a dungeon. The white pieces on the board were hunters and the black pieces were monsters. Hyunwook looked at the board intently. The teacher said that the group had just entered the dungeon and the core was located in the eastern part of the forest. The student replied that they would start moving towards the center and would use the runes they had prepared right after entering the forest. Taking the knight figure in his hand, he said that the healer Hyun would be in the center between the mages. The student himself would be in front and Henson should stand behind. The student frowned, looking at the teacher, who was talking about the first obstacle in the form of a fairy. He briefly answered that the group would kill her. The teacher, slightly open-mouthed, looked at the student, asking him why he made such a decision. The student explained that most likely a lone fairy is a patrolman, who will be helped by at most one more of the same. The students watched this whole scene, listening to their leader's argument that if they quickly killed her, she would not have time to return to her main group and would not bring reinforcements. A board with figures is shown. The teacher explains that the fairy is 15 meters away from them behind the trees, and she has not yet realized that they have been noticed. The student, holding the king piece, explained that as long as the fairy showed no signs of retreating, they would move in closer, prepare their magic, attack, and kill it. The teacher closed his eyes and said that the group was getting closer to the core. The student frowned. The teacher said that the students were being attacked by a group of angry fairies. The student, holding one of the pieces, thought about their next move. Narrowing his eyes, he said that the group would focus on getting their formation right. Imagining the battlefield as chess pieces, he explained that they would make sure that the fairies did not carry them away. Then they would deal with the fairies that were flying straight at them, and that their main goal was to simply survive the attack. Sitting at the table, they looked into each other's eyes as the student said that they would only kill the fairies that were flying straight at them. The student, taking the king piece in his hand again, knocked down one of the black pieces, saying that after the fairies retreated, they would destroy the core before anything happened. The black king piece lay near the board, while the student continued to say that the purpose of their raid was to clear the dungeon and they were not interested in the fairies' further actions. The teacher looked at him, slightly raising his head. The student, looking at him, waited for what would happen next. The teacher smiled and said that everything was fine. The student leaned back in his chair, hearing the teacher's words that the raid was complete. He, still leaning back in his chair, asked about the result. The teacher, throwing his arm over the back of the chair, said that there were no results in the dungeon. The student looked at him in confusion. The other students looked questioningly at HWE when he told them that the main result was the state of the participants, namely life or death. The teacher smiled, saying that now the students would go in turns. All the students except Hansung breathed a sigh of relief as the teacher said he was next. The student sat down at the table and heard the question of who would be the replacement now. The student lowered his head and immediately replied that it would be Hyunwook, explaining that he was more experienced and skilled. The teacher picked up a black figure and announced that the group had entered the dungeon. The student, with his mouth wide open, listened to the teacher's words about their group having encountered 6 fairies wandering around the city. Hansung, with sweat appearing on his face, tried to object, explaining that this had never happened in the dungeon they were in, to which the teacher replied that this was a completely different dungeon and he had not said that there would be anything similar. The student frowned, listening to the teacher say that no 2 dungeons were the same in the world. The teacher, putting his fingers to his temple, reminded him that with this lesson he would teach the students to use their brains and that there was no easy way to learn it. The siren flapped her wings. She flew into the air, causing a wave to form beneath her. Soken met her gaze while being drenched in water. He narrowed his eyes and thought that without Miss Kim, things would not have been easy. The siren used her hypnotizing skill, starting to sing. The hand of one of their group appeared. Soken remembered all those who died here because they simply underestimated this dungeon because of the sirens. This hunter was falling into the abyss. The headmaster of the academy knew that in 3 years, not a single hunter came out of here alive. The one who fell down was wrapped in vines, while Soken continued to remember all the details about this dungeon and those hunters who were devoured by the sirens. Miss Kim turned to look at the fallen one. He showed his hand in response that everything was fine. The lead hunter stabbed his spear into one of the sirens, thinking about the rune that could only muffle the voices of the sirens. He continued to look at that siren, thinking about Hwija, because initially his goal was just to observe, but the hero was able to make everything more convenient. The protagonist and the hunter Soken stood in front of the board. A year had already passed since then, namely since the incident with the Ark and the school, because of which the hunter could not go to the dungeons. The director, covering his ears, tired of ignoring the pressure from the people from the government, he understood that under such circumstances, an experienced hunter would deviate from the course of training students, but even so, the desire to develop a training program came out of nowhere. One of the hunters was fighting a siren. Soken, thinking about the incident with the Ark, wanted to spend some time raising it. Smiling happily, he understood that 30 years old is the perfect age for his talent as a hunter to blossom. An S-rank hunter was attacked by one of the sirens. He struck the siren's paw with his spear. After flying a little, it dodged the next blow. The hunter tensed his legs. He jumped so high that the siren did not expect it. Soken, raising his spear, flew above her. He pierced the siren with his weapon. She fell to the ground. The other siren, baring her teeth, looked at this. She jumped and flew. The monster flew straight at Miss Kim. The siren was already very close. Soken rushed towards her to cover her with his body. The monster sank its claws into the hunter's back. One of the hunters just shouted his name. In the room, similar to a classroom, it sounded like everyone had become accustomed to the simulations over the past few days. HWE looked haughtily at the seated students and said that until now they acted in turns, but today they would try a different approach. So if after listening to the description of the situation, someone came up with a suitable plan of action, he should not hesitate to suggest it. He began to walk between the desks, explaining as he went that the monsters were inside the pixies, and Hyunwook grumbled discontentedly that 5 meters had fallen to the pixies. HWE began to talk about a passage on the floor under the starry sky and that after passing through the gate, they would find themselves on this plain where a forest was visible in the distance, but it was at least 10 kilometers away. Hyunwook raised his hand and asked if anyone knew the location of the dungeon core. HWE closed his eyes and tiredly said that this place had not yet been properly explored, and neither the dungeon core nor the squeak were visible on the plain, to which Hyunwook asked if there were any hiding places. HWE thought about the glowing eyes of the pixies and said that there were no hiding places, so as soon as the students stepped through the gate, it should be considered that all their movements were in full view of the monsters. One of the girls folded her arms and asked discontentedly what the weather was like inside the dungeon, to which the immediate answer was that it was clear and sunny there. The girl thought about it. Suddenly, she suggested starting a fire, which greatly surprised her classmates. The girl thought about the pixies and said that they rarely leave their territory, but they are wary of strangers and are smart enough to set ambushes or traps, and knowing this, crossing the plain directly is tantamount to giving the monsters an advantage. HWE looked at her carefully, listening to how if they set everything on fire with magic, the pixies, even with their ability to fly, will not be able to go far. To which he immediately interrupted her and asked about their squad and what if the fire is so strong that it destroys the entire forest? Will the team remain safe in that case? However, the student was not discouraged and said that they can simply temporarily go beyond the gate. The man froze and looked at the girl thoughtfully. She smiled awkwardly and then asked if she had said something strange. However, the teacher took a sticker in the form of a coin. He stuck it on the girl's forehead. She froze in surprise that there was now a sticker on her forehead. HWE gave him a thumbs up and said that the girl had done a great job. The students looked at him in surprise when the man asked what he would have to do if the girl collected 10 of these stickers. He wanted to tell her about collecting 10 stickers, but his attention was distracted by something. A yellow sports car appeared outside the window. Teachers immediately began to come out of their offices and greet Yimin. An injured woman was sitting behind the wheel of the car and asked HWE to go with her to the hospital. The man immediately approached her, asking if they had failed the quest to go to the hospital, to which Yimin replied that the quest had been a success, but then she hesitated, unable to continue her sentence. She breathed out the name Soken heavily. HWE immediately froze tensely, thinking that this simply couldn't be true. He turned to one of the hunters and apologized, since he had to go in first, so he asked him to make sure that the students returned home safely. Some time passed. The wind walked across the field, whistling through the dry grass. As he drove past the field in the car, HWE nervously thought about whether his uncle could have gotten hurt because of some sirens, and what the matter was. Yimin abruptly broke the silence, saying that she would say everything at once. She squeezed her scratched hand on the steering wheel and said that she was against it, but the man asked again. Then the woman yelled that she said she was against it. HWE was taken aback that she would yell at him about how anyone could do that and that she would rather die than work with his uncle again. She almost pressed her head against the steering wheel, saying that Sok Kyung was an absolutely unbearable person. HWE grabbed the seat belt and asked with unconcealed anxiety why they were going to the hospital. The woman tiredly ran her hair. She looked at her watch and checked the time, then said that it looked like it was just beginning and asked him to turn off his phone and go to any news site, since it would definitely be on the front page. He watched the news bulletin about politics and economics, where they were talking on the live broadcast about the Siren's Nest dungeon in Sokcho, Gangwon province, being completely closed. A man standing at the podium said that the details of the passage would be disclosed through the Dasan Guild. There were no casualties. The wounded were taken to the Dean Hospital and are receiving treatment. The man continued to say that in order to give the hunters, tired after the passage, time to recover, the Dasein Guild asked the journalists not to disturb him, to which the journalists began to take more and more pictures and ask whether Soken was seriously injured, to which the man asked them to refrain from asking for an interview. He tried to leave the podium, but the journalists shouted that there were witnesses claiming that Soken was among the hunters taken to the Dean Hospital, but the man said that questions would not be accepted. Some time later, at the Dean Hospital, Hui looked at the IVs in bewilderment. Soken, all bandaged, asked whether Hui should not have come all in tears. However, Hui looked at his uncle and said that he knew it was another pretense, to which he replied that it was the blood of the sirens, but he was really beaten up badly. Yeman admitted that it was her mistake and looked at the director sadly. She remembered the recent events and said that she had not participated in the walkthroughs for a long time and was nervous, and she also blocked her hearing, so she did not notice how the sirens got closer, to which Hui asked about the fact that she could not even put up a shield, and Soken covered her. He wanted to know why the woman was pouring out so much, but she laughed and admitted that it was not for that reason. Remembered that Soken said that he was going to deceive even the guys, and he also admitted to her that it was a pretense only when they had already arrived at the hospital, and, moreover, the huntress Minson was even happy, calling it a great idea. Soken frowned and said that if he told everything in a haphazard manner and the children found out the truth, it would be even more dangerous. He smirked and admitted that he had deliberately attacked several branches, so the ark was now lying low, waiting and watching. Hui looked at his uncle intently, then asked if this meant that Soken had pretended to be injured in order to lull them into a false sense of security and monitor their actions, to which he answered in the affirmative. Kian crossed his arms and angrily asked how Soken could be so unharmed since she had definitely seen how badly Geo had been beaten up. Soken smirked and said that of course she had seen it since she was sitting in the front row, to which Kiman became even more angry and demanded that he answer normally and stop being sarcastic. Soken got angry and shouted that he had already said that he was not injured, so what else did she want from him since he could show her his belly? But Kiman asked with displeasure why she needed to look at the belly of someone like Soken. Hui watched the argument unhappily, which revolved around Soken's age. Finally, the director stopped the arguing first and asked her not to tell anyone about it. Kiman said that she would listen to him first, to which Soken replied that it was his trump card, so let's keep it between them, and Hui prepared to listen. Soken took out the tokens and said that he found them in a dungeon in Mongolia 5 years ago, and it was an item that absorbed all the damage he received. Min leaned forward, surprised that such an item existed, to which the director admitted that it was not infinite and that it had a limit, and every time it received damage, part of the name was carved on it depending on the strength of the blow. Hui heard the first letter of the name appear due to the sirens, and the man immediately said that he was going to the restroom. He went into the restroom, thinking about how even after 20 years, after giving him one of his tokens, Soken's token only had the first letter carved on it. He looked at the token that remained in his possession from the past and thought about what would have happened if he had returned the token to him, had not gone on vacation, if Soken had lasted longer then, and if he had been able to live until he came to Seoul. The man clutched the token and cursed, because these 3 clearly engraved characters were the only proof that his uncle had ever existed. He swallowed nervously. He continued to curse, thinking about how they were the ones that made him realize with particular acuteness that his father was dead. A drop of water splashed loudly on the sink when Hui thought that if he had known this would happen, he would have called him father, because now he no longer understood why he had treasured the word so much, why he had clung to it so much, because in the end he had never said it. Hui, talking on the phone, heard himself called Ying-hoon and answered that it wasn't him. He, sitting on the couch, listened to how if he didn't repay the debt by the end of the month, he was finished, and repeated that it wasn't him. The stranger on the phone continued to get angry, and the protagonist, taking the phone away, rudely denied, and he clarified that he was also being rude to him. The protagonist, putting his hand in his pocket, was perplexed. He pointed his finger at this number. The protagonist began to call. Miss Kim, looking out from behind the table, asked why he wasn't picking up. Hui, handing her the phone, said that the one who used this number before was a debtor and he blocked them, but they were calling from new numbers, demanding a long time, to which the girl asked what would happen if he stopped answering altogether. She snatched the phone from his hands and said that it was teacher Hui's phone, and he stepped away for a moment. Kim, bringing the phone to her ear, was surprised by what she heard. The girl, continuing to talk to the stranger, asked his name, receiving an answer that he was Tiwu's student. The ceiling appeared and it was heard that the teacher would be back soon, and she would tell him to call back immediately. The protagonist, opening his mouth wide, asked why she hung up. Miss Kim, wide-eyed, asked if this was the same one from the ark, to which the protagonist replied that it was number 3. The girl, handing him the phone, said that usually in such matters the one who needs it most should cling to it himself. Hui, lowering his eyebrows, asked if teacher Hong's pretense worked. Looking at the dark room, Kim answered that it had also had too much of an effect on their children, and what should they do about it now? The protagonist, closing his eyes, said that it was already the concern of Teacher Hong. The protagonist, taking the phone, heard how he was addressed and said that he heard how student Tiwu called, having received a positive answer. The guy, pressing his hands, continued that he knew that it was impolite, but in his head there was only him, the teacher. Hui, hearing that he had awakened, widened his eyes in surprise. Continuing to hold the phone, the protagonist was told that he had awakened, but now everything he picked up breaks, and even his younger brothers suffered, which made the protagonist wonder if the third had awakened before. Tiwu said that he did not know what to do with it, and then Hui, squinting his eyes, remembered that after the third left the lab, there was no news about him, but he knew that he was an unsuccessful experiment, and only himself, only half of him, could be called successful. The protagonist, standing next to Miss Kim, asked where he was now. He would come as soon as he could, receiving the answer that he would then send him the address by message. Number 3 thanked him, because he did not know what to do, from which Hui began to smile, saying that everything would be fine, he would be there soon. Kim, opening her mouth wide, said that the timing of awakening was simply amazing. The protagonist, looking at the screen, clarified that maybe he had hidden his awakening since ancient times. Seeing the message, the girl asked if he needed to go there, adding that the teacher did not have a license. Miss Kim took his phone. Looking at the grinning protagonist, she asked if he was hinting that she should take him. The girl, lowering her eyebrows, told him to ask the hunters from Dasan, to which Hui replied that you need to know that the great mage will personally deliver them there so that the scene looks epic, right? Kim, clasping her hands, agreed with him. She watched silently and the protagonist wondered. The girl, opening her mouth, said that she had a great idea. Stretching out her hand, she clarified, student Tiwu asked for help because he could not control his strength, right? Clenching her fist, Kim suggested enrolling him in the demonstration school, receiving the answer that under no circumstances. The protagonist, opening his mouth, said that bringing a person from the Ark to the school could end in something bad, and this was excluded, clarifying whether she had gone crazy. The girl, bulging her eyes, asked, is this the surest way, isn't it? Through the sweat on his face, Hui thought that student Tiwu was with his younger brothers, right? Lowering his hand, he realized that he had fallen into his own trap, because the one who had come to this point for the sake of his brothers would hardly waste his time on trifles now, and he, having heard the word brothers, lost the right to say no. Putting his hand in his pocket, the protagonist said that then they would ask Teacher Hong. Hui and Kim were expressionless. Soken, opening his mouth wide, exclaimed that it sounded funny. Squinting his eyes, the protagonist said that now was not the reception time and asked if he would be a transfer student. The girl, smiling happily, answered that the school was finally starting to look like a real one. The classroom building appeared and someone asked to pay attention. Hui, standing at the board, asked how the task of compiling a guide for the dungeons was going, to which the students answered in different ways. A piece of paper with commendable stickers was visible, and the protagonist said that they should finish it by the end of the week. He lowered his eyebrows and said that today he and Teacher Kim would be leaving first, and that the hunters from the Dasan group would be watching over their return home. Looking at the class, the protagonist continued that he didn't know if he would be able to go out tomorrow, but in any case, let them do their homework properly. Xiao-eun, crossing her palms, was embarrassed. She, sitting at her desk, asked the principal about his condition. Hui, opening his mouth, said that everything was fine, he would go there on his personal business, so they had nothing to worry about. Hyunwook, narrowing his eyes, asked if it was the teacher's personal business, then why was Teacher Kim going with him, receiving the answer that it just happened. Jiyeon, raising her hand, asked if she could also go out all week. The protagonist, looking at her, said that she should do as she pleased, which made her happy. At that very moment, it seemed like somewhere in South Korea. A small branch was lying on the ground. Someone picked her up. The boy lowered his head. He noticed a girl walking towards him. The boy stood up, holding his knees. He threw the stick. On the ground was the inscription with his name Hui. The protagonist erased this inscription with his foot. The erased name appeared. Miss Kim's car flew between the red crocodiles. Hui, opening his mouth wide, shouted for the girl to just fly into the pole, to which she replied that she understood. Putting his hands together, Tiwu muttered that from this day on he would live honestly and decently, would take care of his younger brothers and sisters, and continued that he was only 17. There were still so many days of life ahead of him, to which the teachers shouted for him not to say such ominous words. Teacher Kim's car hit the pole. Sitting behind the woman, Tiwu continued to pray and said that it might be because he was too bold in saying that he wanted to become a mid-rank hunter, adding that everyone who awakens dreams of becoming a hunter, and is it a crime to quietly mutter about it? Then Miss Kim was suddenly called out. A huge red crocodile with fangs was visible in front. Kim gaped at the huge beast and asked if HWE knew that she couldn't handle it, to which the protagonist told her to get her rose vines. The protagonist kicked the car window. HWE shouted that right now was their best chance, and holding the rose vine in his hands, he said that this would be enough. The protagonist pulled out the rose vine and thought about how they had gotten to this point. 2 hours ago, the teachers entered the office building and heard the employee say that all the necessary paperwork had been filled out and asked them to wait a minute. Approaching Tiwoo, HWE asked if it was hard for him to control himself, to which he replied that it was easy and much better than in the beginning. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist said that usually the body gets used to it after a day or two, to which the guy asked if that was true, and HWE replied that this is when most accidents happen, so it wouldn't hurt to be careful. The protagonist asked if Tiwoo had any younger siblings, to which he, smiling broadly, answered affirmatively that the orphanage was full of little ones. The employee, holding documents in her hands, called the guy and asked him to come with her for a photo shoot, to which he responded and agreed. Tiwoo, his eyes wide, looked down anxiously. Looking around from under her glasses, Teacher Kim asked if it was true that the guy had just woken up, judging by how he couldn't control his speed, to which HWE told her not to believe Tiwoo. Raising her hand, the girl asked why the protagonist was treating the child like that, and whether he had done anything bad to HWE, to which the man replied that she was almost right. Imagining Tiwoo's face, the protagonist thought that no matter how he looked at it, he himself was definitely not awakened at that moment, and asked himself if that meant that the boy had truly awakened right now by chance. HWE frowned, and the thought occurred to him that they had managed to achieve artificial awakening in the arc. Remembering the papers scattered on the floor, the protagonist wondered if the river of promises had been spread because of this. Closing his eyes, HWE said that although he had saved children in Medong, changing one thing or another, but not to such an extent, to which Kim looked at him questioningly. The protagonist called out to the employee, to which he responded in bewilderment, and HWE asked, not knowing how to explain, if he had such a thing. A tall building was visible in the distance. In HWE's hand, a container with red peas was visible, and the guy asked if it was a liquid monster. Raising his hand, the protagonist said that this was a gift for awakening, and asked to squeeze it. Tiwoo squeezed the gift in his hand. The peas scattered, to which Tiwoo exclaimed in alarm. The guy said what to do with it, because the teacher gave it to him with such difficulty, to which HWE turned back and said that everything was fine. If he collected it, it would become whole again, and the guy asked him again. The protagonist continued that it was a liquid monster for the awakened, a kind of training kit, to which Tiwoo, with his mouth wide open, asked if this was the thing. Raising his hand, the protagonist explained that only the power of an awakened level could break these balls, because they would stick back together until the magic stored inside ran out, and added that if Tiwoo could compress them so that they did not fall apart, it would mean that everything worked out. Holding the balls in his hands, the guy asked if it was true that there were many amazing things here. A large intersection appeared. People passed by the car, and Teacher HWE began to speak. Looking down, the protagonist asked what the guy was going to do next, to which he asked him again, and the teacher continued that usually at his age, after awakening, everyone dreams of becoming a hunter. With her hands on the steering wheel, Miss Kim asked if the teacher thought the same, to which the protagonist replied that he awakened much earlier. Grinning, the protagonist continued that he didn't want to become a hunter at all, which surprised Teacher Kim. Smiling, Kim asked how it could happen that such a person became a hunter, to which HWE sighed and thought that he had originally planned to persuade Tiwoo to become a hunter and enroll him in Shibango. Closing his eyes, the protagonist replied that he had unexpectedly found it interesting, and turning to the guy, added that if he suddenly wanted to become a hunter, he would help him. HWE asked if he was talking about Shibango, to which Tiwoo, wide-eyed, asked again if it was true that it was the highest school for training hunters. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist replied that this school was not yet fully fledged, there were some shortcomings, but the director would soon sort everything out, and added that the director was the one who was often mentioned in the news these days. Miss Kim gave a thumbs up and said that the director would be discharged soon, so Tiwoo could ignore the dark rumors. HWE said that it was much better than getting involved with some guild anyway, and added that if the boy was interested, he could call him, to which he thanked the teacher. With the corners of his lips lowered, Tiwoo looked out the car window. Looking at the running people, the boy asked why these people were panicking so much. Loud screams were heard about running, and the salamander appeared. HWE hung on to the pole and shouted that they should crush it as it was. The rose vine covered the pole. The salamander began to make loud sounds. The red crocodile fell to the asphalt. The rose vine continued to stretch. The protagonist made his way from side to side closer to the monster with the help of the vine. The protagonist covered the monster's mouth with it. The monster screamed fiercely. The vine wrapped around the salamander's neck. HWE frowned and pulled the vine with all his might. When the protagonist sat on the neck, the monster shook its head. Miss Kim tried to move the car away from the salamander's blow. The frightened Tiwoo said that from now on he would really live an honest and virtuous life, and teacher Kim, with her mouth wide open, asked if it worked. The heroes squealed in fear when they saw the silhouette near the windshield. The girl exclaimed the teacher's name, to which he, climbing into the car, asked if it was worth such a fright. The protagonist, lowering his eyebrows, said that the big beast was unconscious, and the small ones would not be able to get through because the path was blocked, to which Miss Kim said that they were lucky, and that was impressive. The protagonist asked student Tiwoo which way to go to get to the orphanage, to which the student, with his mouth wide open, said that he should turn right first, then left. The street of the city after the monster attack appeared, and teacher Hui thought about why there were no evacuation announcements or signals in such an emergency, and added that it was too strange for everything to be resolved with just an emergency message. The heroes approached the building, leaving the car and rose vines on the road, and the protagonist asked if it was true what Tiwoo said about his younger siblings being in this orphanage, to which he replied that it was true, they were in this orphanage. Ms. Kim's hands emitted magic, and she asked if the big guy was the boss, to which teacher Hui replied that it was unclear, because he seemed a bit small for the boss. The heroes moved towards the building, and the girl said that it was still good that there was no fire, because it was hard to imagine what would have happened if the salamander also emitted flames, to which the protagonist asked not to scare them with such words. Lowering the corners of his lips, Hui thought that something was wrong. The heroes approached the entrance, and the protagonist wondered why the smell of blood was coming from the shelter.